Welcome to another one of our compilations. In this video, you have a mix of creepy and mysterious topics, coming in at almost 3 hours long. We hope you enjoy these super long compilations, but before we begin, we'd like to say thank you to a very special sponsor of this video, Yours app. Concentration is absolutely vital to unlocking your best performance on a daily basis while managing the heavy workload life often brings. For us, our minds must be meticulous, and our focus must be sharp to release the amount of content we feature on Top 5s and our family of channels, while staying on top of our personal lives as well. You've probably joined us on the same journey, desperately trying to figure out how to stay refreshed, lively, and productive without letting your brain go to mush. Luckily, our newest partnership with Yours app delivers pristine self-care and mindfulness, and they're only a few clicks away. So click on the link in the description or comment section below to get started. Yours app is the fastest growing, most comprehensive and bang for your buck personal wellness application on the market, featuring yoga classes, meditation guides, sleep studies, breathing clocks, and tons of advice from reputable psychological experts. It's proven to help you sleep better and fuller, reduce stress and anxiety, and take control of your mind so you can improve your emotional, physical, and mental health. It utilizes the latest AI technology to give you a personalized feel to the app, as well as beginner-friendly controls, no matter your experience with wellness apps. It's available on both iOS and Android devices and features freemium content, so even if you can't pay a cent, there's free things to explore regardless. Yours app also withholds plenty of content for both children and parents alike. So no matter your background, there are fitness routines, relaxing music options, and easy yoga courses to get you in your optimal shape. To join in on the fun, just go to yoursapp.com/top5s to get a massive 60% off discount from the yearly Yours app subscription using the code TOP5s. Again, that's yoursapp.com/top5s and use the same Top5s code upon checkout for your premium coupon. It's completely risk-free, as there is also a 7-day free trial and a 30-day money-back guarantee. So stop waiting, download Yours app today, and unlock your mind and body's full potential. And now, if you haven't already done so, hit those lights, sit back, and enjoy this compilation. Luke Durbin. 19-year-old Luke Durbin from Hollesley, Suffolk, went missing in the early hours of Friday the 12th of May 2006. Luke had taken time off work from his job at a local greengrocery to meet his friend Alex, who was visiting from London. Alex lived in Woodbridge, and Luke drove his new motorbike over to his house and left it there along with his keys, wallet, and change of clothes. The two men then headed out for the night with another friend, Zach. After having drinks in a local pub, the three took a taxi to Ipswich to go clubbing at Zest nightclub. Sometime during the night, Alex took a taxi cab back to his place after having too much to drink. Luke and Zach stayed in the club, but later became separated. At between 2 AM and 3 AM, Luke was spotted at Ipswich train station, but after being told no trains were running, he left. Next, he is captured on CCTV at around 3:45 AM, heading to Hawk Express taxicabs. But because he has left his wallet at Alex's place, the receptionist suggests Luke call his mum for her bank card details. He refused, stating he didn't want to wake her. At 4 AM, Luke is captured walking across a zebra crossing heading towards the bus station. This is the last positive sighting of Luke, shortly after a silver or white Volvo 440 is caught on CCTV, with the registration M206LYE, later discovered to be false plates. This vehicle is of primary interest to investigators. The next day, Luke's family assumed he had gone to work, but after realizing he hadn't and they couldn't contact him, he was reported missing. Police started extensive searches as they were very concerned for his welfare, as it was so out of character for him to be out of touch with his mum and sister for any length of time. After Luke's movements were seen on CCTV, a witness came forward and reported seeing an individual that matched his description, walking near Foxhall Stadium in Ipswich on May 12, 2006, between 7:30 and 8 AM. This lead was investigated twice, but failed to produce any answers. Another sighting on the 13th of May 2006 between 11 AM and 2 PM placed Luke in a dark blue Renault Megane car near the Durbin Centre car park in Quayside Woodbridge. Again, this lead led to nothing. Then, almost a year after Luke disappeared, a former classmate of his reported seeing him outside Aldwych Theatre in Drury Lane, London. Several years later, in 2011, a 29-year-old man and a 24-year-old woman were arrested for identity fraud after using Luke's details for making online purchases in August 2007. The pair were questioned but later released. Another 2 arrests were made in June 2012, a 40-year-old man suspected of murder and a 25-year-old suspect as an accomplice, but both were released after questioning and a search of their homes. In recent years, it's been speculated that Luke was mixed up in drug dealing and that he owed money to a gang from London. However, there is no conclusive evidence of this, and Suffolk police have described Luke Durbin's disappearance to be one of their most baffling cases ever. If any of you can offer information regarding Luke's disappearance, please call the Major Investigation Team in the UK on 01473 782 019. Chad Gibson. Chad Gibson was raised in London but moved to Cornwall when he was 17 to live with his father. His mother Sharon, who he was very close to, later followed her son to Cornwall and settled in St Austell near Newquay, and at the time of his disappearance, Chad was living with his mother. Chad was father to a daughter named Annie, and he had her name tattooed on the left side of his neck. The relationship with the child's mother didn't last, although he remained a doting hands-on father. In the run-up to Christmas 2015, 32-year-old Chad told his mum that he had met a woman that he really liked and was hoping to meet her that weekend. On Saturday the 19th of December, Chad left his mum's house at 11 AM and headed into town to meet friends for a drink. It was raining and Sharon offered him an umbrella, which he declined and said he would see her later. That was the last time his mum saw him. When Chad didn't come home that night, his mother just thought he was out having fun. It wasn't unusual for him to link up with friends and come home the next day. But as the days came and went, and Chad still didn't come home, his mum started to worry. But he was a grown man, so initially she tried to convince herself he was just with friends and continued with her plan to visit her daughter in London for Christmas. But when Chad didn't contact her on Christmas Day, she realised something was very wrong. And when she returned to Cornwall on Boxing Day, and it was obvious Chad hadn't been home, she reported him missing to the police. However, the case wasn't initially treated as a priority, as officers believed he was simply partying over the festive season. After a social media appeal, Sharon learned that her son had been in the Central pub in Newquay on the day he disappeared. He had been seen speaking to a friend about the woman he had met when he was overheard by a man claiming to be the woman's one-off boyfriend. Chad reportedly tried to defuse the situation, apologising to the man and explaining that he didn't know she was in a relationship. But the man and his friends wouldn't let it drop and reportedly followed Chad into the toilet where there was a confrontation. The men then, for unknown reasons, allegedly took a photo of Chad. Chad then left the pub at around 6 PM and was captured by CCTV as he crossed the road with 2 men. He was never seen again. Then, in a cruel twist in August 2016, Sharon thought she might finally have answers when police informed her human remains had washed up at a hamlet north of Newquay. Although devastated, Sharon believed her son had been found and started organising his funeral. However, shortly after, Sharon got a phone call from police saying DNA proved the body was not her Chad. 5 years later, and there is still no sign of Chad, and the heartache for his family continues. If anyone has any information on Chad's whereabouts, please click on the link in the description to report a sighting or give information. Connie Lynn Royce. Connie Lynn Royce was a divorced 24-year-old business school student. After her marriage ended, she briefly lived with another man, until that relationship broke up after a verbal fight that involved the police, and Connie moved back in with her parents in Madison Heights, Michigan. On June 1st, 1990, Connie left her parents' house to go on a date with Greg, a man she had met just a few days before. Connie drove to his apartment in Sterling Heights, where she met up with Greg and his friend Brad. The three had a few drinks before leaving for the Hayloft Bar, a now defunct bar in the 100 block of North Gratoit in Mount Clemens, Michigan. When the three arrived at the Hayloft, they could be seen on video entering the bar. At the time, the Hayloft was one of the few bars in the area with video surveillance. At around 10:50 p.m, the friends are sitting around a table when Greg gets up to use the bathroom. While he is gone, Connie turns to Brad and says, "I can't do this," and gets up and heads for the exit, leaving her shoes and purse behind. Connie can clearly be seen on camera leaving the bar. She is obviously under the influence of either drugs or alcohol, and is seen bumping into a wall as she staggers out. When Greg returns to the table, Brad tells her that Connie has left, and the pair go to the entrance to look for her. They ask several people if they saw her leave, but none of them did. Greg and Brad return to their table and stay at the bar, waiting for Connie to come back for her purse and shoes. By 2 a.m. closing time, Connie is still not returned, and when Greg gets back to his apartment, Connie's car is still parked there. Connie is reported missing, and an investigation is launched. Hayloft staff tell police that nothing seemed amiss with the group that night. There was no arguing, no yelling, and nothing that concerned them. A witness came forward with a supposed sighting of Connie at a payphone near the bar around the time she left. And also a late 1970s model car was near her, but no one saw if she got in or not. A few days after her disappearance, Connie was reportedly seen at the Newport Apartments about 5 minutes away from the Hayloft, but this led to nothing. Greg and Brad were investigated and cleared of any involvement by police, and Connie's ex-husband and ex-boyfriend were also questioned, but they both had alibis and were cleared. Over the years, a few theories have been proposed about what could have happened to Connie. She was clearly under the influence of something, and it had been suggested that she wandered into the Clinton River and fell in. However, divers searched the waters and the nearby water treatment plant, but no evidence was found. It has also been theorized that Connie was drugged by an unknown person who then followed her when she left the bar, but again there is nothing to support this. Based on the reported sighting of Connie at the payphone, it is possible she tried to call someone to pick her up, but either couldn't get through, or the person who picked her up is responsible for her disappearance. Another theory is that she was seen wandering around near the road and was offered a ride by the wrong person. It's been over 30 years now, and the only real lead is the bar CCTV footage that seemed to be the last sighting of her before she vanished into thin air. If Connie is still alive, she is now in her 50s. If any of you can help with this case, call Macomb County Sheriff's Office on 586-307-9358. Brian Schaeffer. 27-year-old medical student Brian Schaeffer had the world at his feet. He had a loving family, a girlfriend, and was a med student studying at Ohio State University. But on April 1st, 2006, he disappeared without a trace, and to this day, his whereabouts is unknown. On the night he disappeared, Brian had a meal with his father, Randy. The family were grieving, as just 3 weeks before, Brian's mother had passed away from cancer. After the meal, Brian's father urged him to go home, but Brian was keen on celebrating the beginning of spring break and planned to meet his friend, William Florence, at the Ugly Tuna Saloon. Brian left his father and at around 9:30 p.m. met William at the bar for drinks. About 30 minutes later, he called his girlfriend Alexis, telling her he loved her and that he would see her when she came back from Columbus. The pair had a trip to Miami planned and were scheduled to leave on April 3rd. After speaking to Alexis, Brian and his friend visited several other bars and made their way down to the Arena District. At around midnight, they met up with Redith Reed, a friend who gave them a lift back to the Ugly Tuna Saloon, where the group continued drinking shots and other hard liquor. While at the bar, for the second time, Brian got separated from his friends. They called his phone several times, but he didn't answer, and eventually they left without him when the bar closed at 2 a.m. They waited around outside for a bit, but when Brian didn't show up, they figured he had already gone back to his apartment. Over the next 48 hours, Alexis made several calls to Brian's phone, but was unable to reach him. And when on Monday morning, Brian missed his flight to Miami, he was reported missing to the Columbus Police Department. Security footage from the Ugly Tuna Saloon showed Brian outside of the bar at around 1:55 a.m, talking briefly with two young women, then moving off camera in the direction of the bar, apparently to re-enter. Take a look. However, the camera did not capture him leaving again when the Ugly Tuna closed. Brian's car was found parked at his apartment, which was near the Ugly Tuna Saloon, and personal belongings were found inside. His cell phone and bank cards are missing, and haven't been used since he vanished. All those who were with him on his night out were interviewed by police, and some of them took and passed lie detector tests, apart from his friend William Florence, who refused, and the two girls he spoke to outside the bar, who weren't asked. Brian's disappearance was completely out of character. His friends and family said of course he was grieving for his mother, but he was not inordinately depressed or suicidal, and they don't believe that was a factor in his disappearance. Police do not believe Brian left on his own accord, but to this day have no idea where he is, despite many tips coming in that have led to nothing. In the years after Brian disappeared, his family and girlfriend continued to search for him, and even consulted a psychic who said Brian's body was in water near a bridge pier. This revelation prompted family and friends to wade along the shores of the Olentangy River in the hope of finding something, but nothing materialized. In September 2008, tragedy struck the family again when Brian's father was killed in a freak accident when a tree fell on him. In a cruel twist, the condolence book opened for him. One of the signatures in it said, "To Dad, love Brian, US Virgin Islands." This suggested Brian might have left Columbus for a new life elsewhere. However, this was later confirmed to be a cruel hoax. To this day, the question remains, is Brian dead? Was he murdered that night? Or did he take off and is alive, living a new life elsewhere? If you have any information regarding the disappearance of Brian Schaeffer, please contact the Columbus Police Department at 877-645-8477. Brittany Drexel. Brittany Drexel grew up in the Rochester suburb of Chile with her mother Dawn and her adopted father Chad. Brittany was blind in her right eye after being born with persistent hyperplastic primary vitreous, and to cover the eye's tendency to wander, she wore contact lenses that gave her a distinctive appearance. In 2008, Brittany's world was rocked when Dawn and Chad separated. The split affected her school grades and aggravated the depression she had long suffered from. Brittany stayed with her mother, but was in close contact with her father. In April 2009, Brittany asked her mum if she could go to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, over spring break with some girlfriends. Her mum refused, as there were no adults going, and Brittany was furious. Mother and daughter argued over it for a couple of days, before Brittany announced that she was going to stay at a friend's house to cool down for a couple of days. Her mum agreed that was a good idea. However, instead, 17-year-old Brittany met up with a group of friends and travelled with them to South Carolina, arriving at Myrtle Beach on April 23, 2009. They checked into the Bay Harbor Resort on North Ocean Boulevard. 3 days later, Brittany called her mum and told her she was at the beach. Dawn was not alarmed, as she assumed that Brittany had been referring to the beach near her friend's house. She still had no idea Brittany was at Myrtle Beach. At around 8 p.m. on the same day, Brittany left the beach alone and walked 1.5 miles down South Ocean Boulevard to another hotel, the Blue Water Resort, to visit 20-year-old Peter Brozowicz, a longtime friend who was staying there. Security cameras at the Blue Water Resort showed her arriving and then leaving around 8:45 p.m. Throughout her stay at Myrtle Beach, Brittany constantly texted her boyfriend, John Grisso, who had not joined her on the trip due to work commitments. But around 9:15 p.m, After she left the Blue Water Resort lobby, her text to him abruptly stopped. This was so out of character that John began calling Brittany's friends to make sure she was okay, but they too had not been able to contact her. Eventually John called Brittany's mother, Dawn, who was shocked to learn her daughter was at Myrtle Beach, and after repeated calls and texts to Brittany's phone went unanswered, she called the police. Investigations led nowhere. None of the friends Brittany had met during her time at Myrtle Beach could shed any light on where she was, and a search of Brittany's hotel room revealed all of her belongings there, except her purse and cell phone. Over the next 11 days, an extensive search was mounted using air, water, ground and sonar, not just in the Myrtle Beach area, but also at Santee, Charleston and McClellanville areas, but there was no sign of Brittany. The investigation also looked into Brittany's phone, and they tracked network pings 50 miles south of Myrtle Beach, in an area along the US route near the Georgetown/Charleston county line. The ping stopped abruptly on the morning of April 26th. Brittany's mother was convinced that her daughter was trafficked, but the Myrtle Beach police did not think that was likely. Many years passed with no new leads, until in 2016, after the FBI had taken over the case. That's when a jail informant named Taquan Brown claimed he knew what happened to Brittany. He said she had been kidnapped in the Blue Water Resort and taken south to McClellanville, where she was held for 4 days, with a plan to use her for sex work. But the plan was ruined when her disappearance gained so much publicity that she was killed. Brown claimed he saw Timothy Deshawn Taylor assaulting Brittany at a stash house in McClellanville. Based on the information Brown gave them, the FBI and local police believed Brittany's remains could be found dumped in a local alligator pit, as there were several in the area. However, after searching the house and pits and ponds, they found nothing. They also interviewed Timothy Deshawn Taylor, but their investigations have led nowhere. In recent years, Brown has changed his story, saying he saw Brittany alive about a month after she disappeared. And it's hard to know if there is any truth in his claims, as he has also failed lie detector tests when questioned about Brittany's disappearance. It's widely believed that Brittany is likely dead, and Brown and Taylor are involved in some way, but for her family, the wait goes on, and no one really knows what's happened to Brittany Drexel. Anyone with information about her disappearance, please call the FBI tip line on 1-800-CALL-FBI. Tracy Andrews. Andrews was born in 1969 in the West Midlands, England. By 1994, she was a 25-year-old single parent with aspirations of becoming a model. In October of 1994, Tracy met Lee Harvey at Ritz's nightclub in Birmingham, and the attractive couple soon became inseparable, moving in together after just 3 months. Harvey was a bus driver who also had a child from a previous relationship. The couple were both possessive and controlling, and neighbours reported that they were often heard screaming and shouting at each other in the early hours. They split up several times, and Tracy would throw Lee out with his possessions before changing the locks. But the couple would always reconcile, and despite their volatile relationship, after just 6 months of meeting, they decided to become engaged. Police had to be called to their flat multiple times during their 2-year relationship, as they had both assaulted one another on numerous occasions. Family members from both sides advised the couple that they should stay away from one another because of their aggressive arguments. Tracy was seen as the more volatile of the two, and was described by previous boyfriends as easily provoked, intense, and having a wicked temper. On the 30th of November 1996, the couple had, once again, been arguing fiercely all day. They decided to try and resolve their issues, so they went for a drive to a local pub. On the way back to their flat, they drove through a rural area called Cooper's Hill. Andrews later claimed that a dark Ford Sierra car began to follow them, and Lee began a cat-and-mouse chase with the car until it finally pulled in front of them, causing them to stop. Both Harvey and the driver got out of their vehicles, and Tracy could hear them arguing. The driver got back into the car, and a passenger got out. He went over and began to attack Harvey. So Andrews got out of the car and ran to his defense, but the man hit her in the face and knocked her to the ground. When she eventually regained consciousness, she saw that Harvey was lying in the road covered in blood. She went over to him and cradled him as he died. Harvey's car had come to a halt outside a property known as Keeper's Cottage. The resident there took Andrews inside while they called the police. Lee Harvey died at the scene from blood loss. He had been stabbed 42 times in a brutal and sustained attack. Many of the stab wounds were in Harvey's back. A massive murder hunt began, and there was huge media interest, so a televised press conference was called in the hope that someone would have some information about the road rage killer, who Tracy described as being fat with staring eyes. Andrews looked very much like the distressed victim, with 2 black eyes and a cut nose. She appealed for help to find the killer, but made a mistake when answering a question about the time that the couple had left the public house. This led police to suspect that she was not telling the truth. Take a look at some of the footage.
Good afternoon. Detectives investigating the murder of a man in last week's so-called road rage attack have arrested a 27-year-old woman. Lee Harvey was stabbed to death in a country lane. His fiancée was with him when he died.
An evening in the pub with her boyfriend ended in death. According to 27-year-old Tracy Andrews, she left the pub with Lee Harvey in his Ford Escort. She told police they overtook another car which gave chase. At a press conference, she described what happened to them.
It was a case of both Lee and the other person were like playing cat and mouse with each other.
Tracy Andrews said Lee Harvey was stabbed to death by a passenger in the second car. An hour ago, West Mercia police said they had arrested a 27-year-old woman. Jackie Rowley, BBC News.
Andrews attempted suicide a day later. Forensic evidence was gathered, which also pointed to Andrews as the actual murderer. Her clothes were analysed, and the bloody impressions of a penknife could be seen in her boot, where she had hidden the murder weapon for disposal later. Witnesses who were driving in the opposite direction as the incident occurred came forward and were able to confirm that they had both seen the white Escort that Harvey and Andrews were travelling in. They saw no other vehicles on the road at the time. Andrews was arrested while still in hospital and stood trial at Birmingham Crown Court. Although she maintained her innocence throughout, she was found guilty of murder on the 29th of July 1997 and sentenced to life imprisonment, with a recommendation that she serve at least 14 years. In 1999, Andrews confessed in a letter to her solicitor that she had killed Lee Harvey, but she insisted that it had been in self-defense. She was a model prisoner and was released in 2011. She was given a new identity and plastic surgery to change her appearance and help hide her identity. Stephen Port. On June 19, 2014, the body of Anthony Walgate, who was 23, was found propped up in a sitting position on Cook Street in Barking, East London. A man named Stephen Port rang 999 to report seeing an unconscious man on the street. When quizzed by police, Port changed his story several times and was convicted of perverting the course of justice. He had hired Walgate as an escort, and when Walgate died of an overdose in his flat, Port dumped his body nearby. He was imprisoned for 8 months, but released after just 2. Port went on to murder another 3 men between the end of August 2014 and September 2015. Gabrielle Cavari, Daniel Whitworth, and Jack Taylor. All of their bodies were found close to Port's flat, and 2 of the men were found in a nearby churchyard by the same dog walker. Port was selecting and grooming the men through the dating site Grindr, and after taking them to his flat, he would give them a fatal dose of the party drug GHB before raping them. Although the deaths were very similar, police did not make a connection between Port and the young men. They were working up the assumption that the men had overdosed accidentally whilst using GHB. Port even wrote and placed a strange suicide note in Daniel's hand, which framed him for Gabrielle's murder. And although Daniel's autopsy showed underarm bruising, as though he had been dragged, police did not check the sheet that he was wrapped in or the so-called suicide note for DNA. It was at this time that 41-year-old Port appeared on the BBC programme Celebrity MasterChef, a yearly cookery competition where celebrities compete to win the title in the UK. Port can be seen in an episode from the 9th series of the show. During one part of the competition, contestants have to prove that they can cope with the challenges of mass catering. J.B. Gill, a member of the boy band JLS, and EastEnders actor Emma Barton were cooking pasta and meatballs for 100 workers at the West Ham bus garage in East London. Port can clearly be seen wearing a blonde toupee and chef's whites, grinning at the camera as he helps the contestants to serve the workers. Port worked at the garage for 13 years, and by the time of filming, he was already a rapist and a murderer. Eventually, links between the young men and Port were made by police when he was spotted on CCTV with Jack Taylor. Port's DNA was found on the sheet and note discovered with Daniel's body. In November 2016, Port was tried at the Old Bailey in London and convicted for the assault, rape and murder of all 4 victims. The rape of 3 other men, 10 counts of administering a substance with intent, and 4 sexual assaults. He was given a whole-of-life order. In 2019, Gerald Matuvu, who supplied Port with GHB, was sentenced to 31 years in prison for murdering the actor Eric Mickles under very similar circumstances. Stuart Hazel. During the summer break of 2012, the local community in New Addington, South London, began a desperate search for 12-year-old schoolgirl Tia Sharp. Tia had stayed at her grandmother's house on the Thursday night before she went missing. It was something that she regularly did. Tia had left the house on the following morning to go into nearby Croydon to meet a friend and buy some shoes. She was due to come home at 7 p.m. that Friday, but never returned. Christine Bicknell was Tia's grandmother, and she lived with a man named Stuart Hazel. For a short time, Hazel had dated Tia's mother, Natalie Sharp, but they split up after a couple of weeks, and he began seeing Natalie's mother, Christine. Although he was 10 years younger than Christine, the relationship worked, and he moved into her home on the Linden estate in New Addington in 2007. Over the next 5 years, he developed a close bond with Tia, and she began to call him Grandad. Because Hazel was the last person to see Tia, he became the main suspect into her disappearance. But this was disregarded when his neighbour, Paul Meehan, came forward and said that he was 100% sure that he had seen Tia coming out of her grandmother's house and walking towards the bus stop on the Friday morning, just as Hazel had said. The community on the Linden estate rallied around and organised a huge search, and there was a lot of media interest. Thousands of posters and leaflets bearing Tia's photograph were handed out, and Hazel was seen out with searchers on the estate wearing a missing t-shirt. There was no CCTV of Tia on any of the buses into Croydon the day she went missing, and police could find no other eyewitnesses to corroborate Hazel's story. Once again, the police turned their attention to the last person that had seen Tia alive. They searched Hazel's home for a 3rd time with cadaver dogs on Wednesday the 8th of August, although once again nothing was found. It was at this point that Hazel agreed to take part in a TV interview for ITV News, a popular news channel in the UK.
Just sat down here, on the chair where you are now, Dave. Sitting there watching telly. She picked up your mum's DS up, played the DS for a little while. I said, well, we're going to have some breakfast. So I made her some toast, and she had the toast, and then she wanted a sausage roll, because she's always eating sausage rolls. Basically, and then she was sitting there. She doesn't take her washing up out, so I took her washing up out. Just started doing a little bit of washing up in the kitchen. She was in there. She was telling me what she was doing, but I weren't really logging it into my head. I didn't. Do you know what I mean? Remember, like the kids, they talk to you. It goes in one ear, stays there for a second, and it goes out. You know what I mean? Then I was washing up. As I was hoovering, then she walked out. She walked past me from the front room to go out, and she walked out the front door. That is all I know. And she left her bloody phone on charge because I told her to sit there and leave her phone on charge. I didn't mean leave it on charge, because what Tia doing, she plays on the BB thing, but then she uses it as it's charging, so there's no charge going through to it. So when I said to her, just leave your phone on charge, it means leave her phone on charge, not use it, let it charge up a bit, then you can actually take it with you or whatever, because she's been responsible to go to Croydon before. She's been responsible to go on trains and buses and trams and everything before on her own. Not so much trains, but trams and buses. She's done it all on her own, and it was just an everyday thing. You know, it's just that one time you want to bloody listen to her and you just don't. She said, goodbye. Well, I said, well, make sure you're back at 6. She went, yeah. And that was it, and then the door closed and she walks out.
And tell me a little bit about Tia's life. I mean, is she a happy girl? Is she jolly? Has she got any problems?
No, she's got no problems at all. She's a happy-go-lucky golden angel. You know what I mean? She's perfect. There's no arguments, no nothing, no nothing we can think of, absolutely nothing. They asked me stupid questions yesterday, like, oh, did you do anything to Tia? Well, no, I bloody didn't. Excuse my language, but no, I didn't. I'd never think of that. I'd loved her to bits. She's like my own daughter, for God's sake. We had that sort of relationship. It was that sort of thing. It was just, you know, she wanted it, she got it. She's got a loving home. She's never gone without anything, so I can't work it out. What the hell's going on? Well, if they believe what they read in the papers, they can do whatever they like. Because I know deep down in my heart that Tia walked out of my house. She walked out of there, and I know damn well because she was seen walking down the pathway. I know she made that track down to that way. What happened after that is I don't know. And I wasn't the last person to see her, because the last person to see her was the one walking down the pathway. Tia, come on, babe. Come on. Come and eat your dinner. I want me £10 back from my garden.
Yeah, just
we love you, babe.
We want it back to normal.
Please.
There's nothing. It's going to be back to normal. Just come home and be back in the family. She's part of the family. Come home. Nothing's changed. No one's in trouble. Come home.
Hazel went into a lot of detail during the interview about Tia's movements before she left the house and denied any knowledge of her disappearance. At one point he described Tia as a golden angel and perfect. Looking directly at the camera, he begs Tia to come home, referring to her as babe. On Friday the 10th of August, Tia's grandmother noticed a bad smell coming from the house, which was cleared and once again searched for a fourth time by police. Tia's body was found in the attic, wrapped in bin liners. Because of decomposition, the coroner was unable to establish a cause of death. Hazel had left the house early that morning and not returned. He was spotted buying vodka on CCTV at a supermarket and was later found drunk by a police dog in an area of Parkland. Tia's killer had been right in front of the media the whole time. A memory card was found in the home that contained explicit photos of Tia after her death. In May 2013, Hazel was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 38 years. In early 2015, Paul Meehan, who had given a false statement to the police, was convicted of wasting police time and sentenced to 5 months in prison. Paris Bennett. Piers Morgan has interviewed several convicted murderers for documentaries such as Confessions of a Serial Killer and Killer Women. In 2019, he recorded The Psychopath about the child murderer Paris Bennett. This time the interview could not be held face to face. Instead, Pierce and his team were placed behind toughened glass with armed guards present. When Morgan questioned why this was necessary, he was told that Bennett was too dangerous. The filming took place in America, where Bennett is serving a prison sentence for the murder of his 4-year-old sister, a murder that he committed when he was just 13 years old. Bennett had been diagnosed a psychopath and has an IQ of 141, which is genius level. At the time of the murder, Bennett showed no signs of his psychopathy. He excelled in school and was a loving brother to his younger sister Ella. He decided that he wanted to punish his mother for unknown reasons, but instead of murdering her, he thought that it would be much better to murder his sister. That way his mother would lose both of her children because Ella would be dead and he would go to prison. He decided that it was the ultimate punishment. In February of 2007, while his mother Charity was at work in Abilene, Texas, Bennett manipulated his babysitter into leaving early. In a cold and deliberate act, he then went into his sister's room where she was sleeping, and after sexually assaulting her, he beat her and stabbed her repeatedly. He then rang a friend and chatted for over 10 minutes before dialing 911 and admitting what he had done. He even pretended to perform CPR on Ella while he spoke to the dispatcher, when really he was just walking around the house with the phone. Despite this, his mother Charity still visits him regularly, stating that she loves her children unconditionally and doesn't know how to stop loving Paris. But Charity now has a new son called Phoenix, and she is worried that Bennett may come after them both if he is released.
I remember that a male officer walking past me into the bedroom, and I remember hearing him mutter, "Oh my God," when he saw what I had done. And I remember, I just felt like I was drowning in shame, knowing that they saw what I had done and knew that I had done it.
During the interview, Bennett insists that he is not a monster and that he loves his sister. And although he has never met Phoenix, he claims that he loves him too. He says he is redeemable. and what he did 13 years ago was a mistake, although when asked by Morgan if he knows what love is, his chilling answer is, "I don't know how to answer that." Bennett was sentenced to 40 years for his crime, but because it was committed when he was a juvenile, he was eligible for parole in 2017 when he will be in his 30s. Experts believe that it would be a mistake to release Bennett, as psychopathy cannot be cured, only managed by keeping the psychopath locked up. Throughout the interview, Bennett speaks in a measured and unemotional way, explaining that he has been honest in admitting that he has a dark side, but he is adamant he can control it if he is set free. Morgan said he has never felt as chilled in a bad way as he was by that guy, because he was so intelligent. Bennett is said to be more cunning and more manipulative than any other criminal Morgan had ever met before. Mick Philpott. One man who developed a taste for the media spotlight was Mick Philpott, known to the public as Shameless Mick. He first appeared on the Jeremy Kyle Show with his wife in 2007 to demand a bigger council house for his growing brood of children. The British talk show was extremely popular at the time and dealt with issues of family and relationships. By then, Philpott had already been convicted of the attempted murder of a former girlfriend. Once he shot her in the groin with a crossbow because he thought her skirt was too short. In 2006, by the time he was 50, Philpott had fathered 17 children. He lived with his wife, who was 25, his girlfriend, who was 22, and their 11 children in a 3-bedroom council house in Victory Road, Derby. Lisa, his girlfriend, was Philpott and Mairead's bridesmaid at their wedding. She was only 16 and pregnant with Philpott's child at the time. Philpott chose to live in a caravan in the garden rather than the house. There his wife and mistress would visit him on alternate nights to be what he called serviced. He had complete control over the two women. Philpott then appeared on a program about the benefit culture where he bragged that he didn't need to work because he was taking wages from both his wife and girlfriend and claiming over £50,000 a year in benefits. In early 2012, Lisa decided that she had had enough of Philpott's controlling and violent behaviour, and she was able to get away, taking her 5 children with her. Philpott was livid that Lisa had defied him, and he began a legal battle to get the children back. He decided that he would set fire to the house while the children were still inside and frame Lisa for it. The idea was that he would rescue the children and become a hero. Then he could win the custody battle, be given a bigger house, and reclaim the children's benefits. At about 4 AM on the 11th of May 2012, together with his wife and friend Paul Moseley, Philpott poured petrol through the letterbox of the house and set the fire. It quickly got out of control, trapping and killing 5 of his children, who all died at the scene. Their half-brother, who was 13, also died in hospital 2 days later. Lisa was arrested but quickly released through lack of evidence. Police were beginning to suspect that Philpott was actually the culprit. Philpott displayed bizarre behaviour at both the hospital when visiting his son and at the morgue when he went to identify the children's bodies. There he proceeded to flirt with the female staff members and make inappropriate sexual comments. Never one to miss an opportunity to grab the spotlight, Philpott insisted on having a press conference on May 16th. With his wife sitting beside him, Philpott proceeded to thank the police, fire and emergency services, and neighbours, but never mentioned the children at all. He frequently dabbed his eyes with a tissue as he pretended to cry, but the tissue remained dry throughout. Ironically, he ended the conference by asking for privacy so that he and his wife could grieve.
And we can't express our gratitude to everybody that's been concerned with the case, with what's been going on. I've actually been down to our home, and what we saw, we just cannot believe it. We grew up in a community that's had a lot of problems with violence and God knows what else, and to see this community to come together like they have, it's just too overwhelming.
Desperate now to find evidence and prove what they believed to be true, the police bugged the couple's hotel room. This picked up incriminating conversations. Added to this, forensic analysis found liquid petrol on the clothing of all 3 suspects. Although the charges were reduced from murder to manslaughter because all 3 of the defendants hadn't meant to kill the children, they were all found guilty. Philpott received a life sentence with a minimum term of 15 years. Murray and Mosley were each sentenced to 17 years. Murray was released in 2010 after serving half of her sentence. Chicago Tylenol poisonings. On the morning of September 20th, 1982, 12-year-old Mary Kellerman from Elk Grove Village in Chicago complained to her parents that her throat was sore and she had a runny nose. Her parents gave her one extra-strength Tylenol capsule to ease her symptoms. Tylenol is a perfectly safe over-the-counter painkiller, similar to ibuprofen. But instead of relieving Mary's symptoms, the capsule killed her, as it had been laced with potassium cyanide. The same day, 27-year-old postal worker Adam Janus of Arlington Heights, Illinois, died of what was initially thought to be a massive heart attack. His brother and sister-in-law, Stanley and Teresa, rushed to his home to console their loved ones after his unexpected death. When they arrived, stressed and upset, they both had throbbing headaches, and each took a Tylenol extra-strength capsule they found in Adam's medicine cabinet. Later that day, Stanley died, and 2 days later, Teresa also lost her life. Over the next few days, 3 more unexpected deaths occurred. 35-year-old Mary McFarland of Elmhurst, Illinois, 35-year-old Paula Prince of Chicago, and 27-year-old Mary Weiner of Winfield, Illinois. All 3 were previously fit and healthy. It wasn't until early October that it was revealed all the deaths had one thing in common. They had all taken Tylenol shortly before they died, and all the capsules had been laced with a lethal dose of cyanide. Panic set in amongst the residents of Chicago, and frantic warnings were issued via the media and patrols using loudspeakers, warning residents throughout Chicago to discontinue the use of Tylenol products and ordering a massive recall of the more than 31 bottles of Tylenol in circulation. Police quickly ruled out contamination during production and concluded that the medicine had been tampered with over several weeks, with the culprit adding the cyanide to the capsules before methodically returning to the stores to place the bottles back on the shelves. During the investigation into catching the predator, many suspects were investigated, including James William Lewis, who sent a letter to Johnson & Johnson demanding $1 million to stop the cyanide-induced murders. He was later ruled out as a suspect, but was still charged with extortion and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Eventually all the suspects were ruled out, and to this day, the murderer or murderers have never been caught. Over the years, scarily, other copycat poisonings involving Tylenol and other over-the-counter medications have occurred, though thankfully none as deadly as the 1982 Chicago area incident. Sadly, the deaths that resulted from the Tylenol poisonings can never be undone, but the incident did inspire a series of significant changes to make over-the-counter medications safer, and Johnson & Johnson introduced tamper-proof packaging that is still in use today to ensure something like this can never happen again. As for the perpetrator, well, he or she is still at large. The Pollock Twins. Florence Pollock and her husband John were proud parents of 2 beautiful daughters, 11-year-old Joanne and 6-year-old Jacqueline. The family lived in the pretty English town of Hexham. May 5th, 1957 was just another Sunday for the Pollocks. They got up late, ate breakfast, and made their way to church. But as the 2 girls crossed the street, an out-of-control car careered toward them, striking both the sisters and killing them almost instantly. The driver was an intoxicated mother who was attempting to kill herself after losing custody of her own children. John and Florence were, as you would expect, devastated by the loss of their daughters and felt completely lost. The couple needed children in their lives, so decided to try for another child. On October 4th, 1958, just little over a year after losing their daughters, Florence gave birth to identical twin girls, who they named Gillian and Jennifer. Soon after their birth, the family decided they wanted a fresh start away from the place where the horrible accident had taken place, so they moved from Hexham to a place called Bexley Bay on England's northeast coast. The family settled in with their new babies, who were both happy and healthy. However, as they grew, their parents started to notice some bizarre likeness to Joanne and Jacqueline. Jennifer had 2 birthmarks, one on her waist and the other on her forehead. Their late daughter Jacqueline had a birthmark and a scar in the exact same place. At first, Florence and John thought nothing of it, believing it was just a coincidence. However, as the girls got older and began to speak, the similarities between their twins and their late daughters became too pronounced to ignore. The girls simply knew things they shouldn't have. Almost as soon as they were able to talk, they began asking for their old toys. Confused, the parents asked them to elaborate, and as clear as day, the twins asked for dolls that had belonged to the previous twins, dolls they'd never seen or heard of. From there, the similarities only intensified, and things got more bizarre when the family moved back to Hexham after Florence and John grew homesick. The twins had no memory of Hexham, as they were so young when they moved. But they seemed to know things. They recognized landmarks in Hexham they'd never seen, and they started asking to go places that were their sisters' favourites, and knew Joanna and Jacqueline's school, as well as various friends they'd had. The girls also had the same tastes as their late sisters, and even liked the same foods, clothing and songs. However, some of their knowledge was more disturbing. Their parents had never revealed the true nature of Joanna's and Jacqueline's catastrophic injuries, but despite this, they still seemed to be aware of the gory details of their sisters' deaths. One day, Gillian turned to Jennifer and told her that she could see blood coming from her eyes. Both girls also had a seemingly unexplainable phobia of cars. Florence and John became increasingly convinced their twins were the reincarnation of Joanne and Jacqueline, and that their dead daughters had returned to life as Gillian and Jennifer. However, after the girls turned 5 years of age, with no warning or explanation, the girls stopped mimicking their dead sisters, and as if a switch had been flicked, they lost all memory of their past lives, and they went on to lead normal lives as children and into adulthood. Do you think the twins returned as their dead sisters, or was it all just a bizarre coincidence? What do you think? Frozen Jean Hillard. On a freezing night on December 20th, 1980, 19-year-old Jean Hillard was driving her dad's Ford car along an icy gravel shortcut near Legby, Minnesota, when the car slipped and ended up in a ditch. Jean knew she wasn't far from a ranch, so she scrambled out of the car and decided to walk to get help. The temperature that night was 20 below freezing, and Jean wasn't really dressed for the conditions, and it wasn't long before she started to struggle. The ranch was a lot further away than she first thought. After 2 miles of walking, Jean could finally see the ranch in the distance. That is the last thing she remembers before blacking out. The next morning, the ranch owner, Wally Nielsen, found Jean in his yard. The poor girl was literally frozen solid like a block of ice. Her eyes were frozen open, and Wally was sure she was dead. Wally knew Jean well, as she was dating his friend, and the night before, they'd all been out together, drinking and dancing. But as he pulled her towards his house, he noticed a few bubbles coming out of her nose. Wally, who had a lady friend over, asked her to help him load Jean's body into his truck, but it was so solid it wouldn't fit in the cab, so they had to take the woman's car instead. It appeared there was no hope for Jean. When she arrived at Foston Hospital, doctors also feared the worst. Jean was so frozen they couldn't even get an IV into her arm. The needles kept breaking. They figured she was almost certainly dead, but decided to warm her up anyway with heating pads, and a pastor was called to say prayers. To everyone's surprise, as Jean's body thawed, she started to spasm, and by noon she was talking coherently. In just a few hours, she'd gone from a block of ice to a scared teenager, worrying about her dad finding out his car was in a ditch. She had no idea she had been frozen solid for 6 hours and brought back to life. Due to severe frostbite, doctors considered amputating both Jean's legs to avoid infection. But in the end, Jean went home with little more than blistered toes that were numb for a while. Her case was so remarkable it made headlines, and it was lauded as a modern-day miracle. Jean was in demand to tell her story and toured local churches and appeared on talk shows, and was dubbed the Miracle Girl from Legby, Minnesota. Since her ordeal, Jean has suffered no ill effects from being frozen solid and brought back to life, and went on to get married and have children. Nowadays she lives in Cambridge, Minnesota and works in a Walmart. Whilst it's not unheard of for a human to be thawed out alive after being frozen solid, it is extremely rare, which is why the hospital did everything they could to try and revive her. They have a motto that no one is dead until they're warm and dead, something that almost certainly saved her life. However, what is a mystery, in Jean's case, is the way they thawed her out. These days, with modern medicine, doctors use a special device that pumps the patient's blood through a heater, warming their vital organs from the inside, giving the patient a much better chance of survival. Whereas back in 1980, all Jean had was some heat pads, a lot of prayers, and an incredible amount of luck. The mysterious death of Mary Reese. On a July morning in 1951, landlord Pansy Carpenter received a telegram addressed to Mary Reese, one of the tenants in a Tampa Bay apartment complex. She took the telegram to Mary's apartment and knocked on the door. When there was no answer, she decided to open the door using her keys, but got a shock when the doorknob felt unusually hot, almost to the point of being untouchable. As she entered the apartment, she realized something was very wrong and didn't go any further before calling the police. When the police arrived, they found 67-year-old Mary, along with the chair she was sitting on, burned to ashes. All that was left was her left foot, her skull and part of her spine. Next to her chair was a pile of newspapers completely unaffected by the fire. Also intact was all the furniture, carpets and walls in the apartment. The only sign that there had been a fire at all were a few softened plastic appliances and some soot on the ceiling above Mary's cremated body. The investigation into Mary's death perplexed the police. For Mary to have burned to ash like she had would have required a temperature of around 3,000 degrees, and yet her living room contained almost no evidence of a small fire, let alone an inferno. Her skull had shrunk to a very small size, an anomaly which complicated the investigation further, as normally under intense heat the human skull would blow up, often to the point of explosion. The only thing they could confirm with certainty was that Mary met her death in the early hours of the morning at around 4:30 a.m, as this was the time her clock had stopped after its socket had melted. With nothing else to go on, the police sent Mary's remaining foot, 6 small objects thought to be teeth, part of the carpet and some glass shards found in the ashes, to the FBI Director Edgar Hoover, with a note requesting information or theories on what could have caused a human body to incinerate in such a small area with so little damage to anything around it. After several weeks, the FBI declared it was a case of the wick effect, caused by the unfortunate combination of Mary's flammable nightgown, her cigarette, and the fact she had taken sleeping pills. It was theorized that Mary had either died from a stroke or heart attack, or was unconscious under the influence of sleeping pills, when her lit cigarette fell on her nightclothes and burned through her skin like a candle. However, the problem with this theory was it didn't quite explain how enough heat was generated to cremate a human body or why the skull had shrunk. This theory was quickly dismissed by another expert, and the St. Petersburg police were back at square one. It was later suggested that Mary might have been murdered and burned at a different location and then brought back to the apartment. However, again, this theory was flawed, as the killer would have had to have had access to crematorium equipment, and why bring her back with a burnt chair? Then of course there is the speculation that Mary's death was a case of spontaneous human combustion, when an object ignites and burns without an external source of fire. However, the FBI and the police categorically ruled out this theory in the Mary Reese case, although even today the case is incorrectly described as spontaneous human combustion. The truth is, there is still no single satisfying theory that explains all the elements of Mary's death, and 70 years later, it remains one of the biggest unsolved mysteries in modern history. The real Walter Collins. On March 10, 1928, a 9-year-old boy named Walter Collins disappeared from his Los Angeles neighborhood after a trip to the cinema. The police searched frantically for the boy, and his disappearance received nationwide attention. But despite many leads, they turned up nothing. and the Los Angeles Police Department came under increasing pressure to solve the case. Then 5 months after Walter vanished, a boy claiming to be Walter handed himself in to police in DeKalb, Illinois. Walter's mother Christine saw photographs of the boy, and they exchanged letters, and believing he was her son, she paid for him to be brought to Los Angeles. But when Christine was reunited with her son, she told the police the boy was not Walter. However, the officer in charge of the case, Captain J.J. Jones, was under pressure to get the case wrapped up, so he convinced Christine to take the boy home and try him out. After 3 weeks, Christine was still convinced the boy was not Walter, and she obtained Walter's dental records to prove the boy was an imposter. However, Captain Jones wouldn't accept the boy wasn't Walter, and he accused Christine of being a bad mother, who was trying to abandon her son. He also told her she was bringing ridicule to the police department. Jones then had Christine committed to a psychiatric ward at Los Angeles County Hospital, under a Code 12 internment, a term used to jail or commit someone who was deemed difficult or an inconvenience. Whilst Christine was held against her will, the boy was questioned again, and a handwriting expert determined that the boy's handwriting samples did not match Walter's. He later admitted he was 12-year-old Arthur Hutchins Jr., who ran away from home after his mother died. When police initially picked him up in Iowa and asked him if he was Walter Collins, he said no, but then said yes, believing by posing as the missing boy, he could get a free trip to California so he could meet his favourite actor, Tom Mix. After the revelation, Christine was released and filed and won a lawsuit against the Los Angeles Police Department and Jones. Christine won the case and was awarded $10,800, which Jones never paid. He was initially suspended by the LAPD, but later permanently reinstated. It is widely believed that Walter Collins was one of the victims of serial killer Gordon Stewart Northcott and his mother Sarah Louise Northcott. The Northcotts kidnapped, sexually abused and killed several boys in what became known as the Wineville Chicken Coop murders. Although they were never charged with the murder because police couldn't find any physical evidence that conclusively linked Walter to them. Although after speaking to Gordon shortly before he was executed, Christine was convinced her son was not one of their victims, as she thought he was insane, and his vague replies and his refusal to remember any details about Walter's clothing or appearance gave her hope that her son was still alive. Christine held out hope for decades that Walter was still alive, and she continued searching for him until she died in Los Angeles in 1964. 36 years after her only son went missing. To date, no one exactly knows what happened to Walter Collins. In 2008, the film Changeling was released, starring Angelina Jolie as Christine Collins, that repeated the events of Walter Collins' disappearance and his links to the Wineville Chicken Coop murders. The Discovery Pendulum Disaster in India. Kankaria Adventure Park is situated next to Kankaria Lake in the western state of Gujarat, India. The lakefront has many public attractions, including a zoo, balloon rides and a water park, as well as the amusement park. A pendulum swing consists of a large circular gondola. There are 30 to 40 roller coaster style seats around the outside of this, and riders are strapped in using shoulder restraints while their legs dangle over the edge. The gondola then hangs from an arm attached to a main column. It's suspended above the ground from this overhead axis, which swings back and forth while the gondola spins simultaneously. Riders experience moments of weightlessness as they are whipped towards the ground at speeds of nearly 70 miles per hour, while the arms lift them to a height of 147 feet at an angle of 120 degrees. There are several different types of this ride in amusement parks all over the world. It was a busy summer day at the Kankaria Park on July 17, 2019, and the Discovery Pendulum Swing was filled to capacity. The pendulum ride had just started to pick up speed when a 20-ton load-bearing cable snapped, causing the pendulum arm to break off. The gondola, which was carrying 30 passengers who were between the ages of 16 and 26, smashed into the main shaft of the ride before falling to the ground. 2 of the riders were instantly killed, with at least 15 others suffering from critical injuries, and dozens more with minor complaints. Sadly, the 2 men killed were just 24 and 22. Park guests immediately rushed over to the scene and tried to help trapped and bleeding passengers. Some had broken limbs, while others were unconscious and unresponsive. There are many videos of the disaster online, as people were filming their loved ones on the ride at the time, and some of these videos are extremely graphic, showing the injured close-up. Police and a forensic team were called to the park to try and find out the reason for the accident. The local Deputy Commissioner of Police said that an inspection would be made to check all aspects of operation and maintenance, as well as questioning the agency responsible for regular independent checks. The managing director of Kankaria Adventure Park insisted that the company took every possible care with the rides, and that the Discovery pendulum had been checked only 1 week earlier. Despite his assurances, he was arrested along with another 5 members of the Superstar Amusements who run the park. All 6 men were charged with culpable homicide, not amounting to murder, and the investigation continues. Unfortunately, it wasn't the first time that a Discovery pendulum swing had snapped and caused the death of a rider. Just a month earlier, on the 29th of June, a 19-year-old girl was killed at the Balvatika amusement park in Uzbekistan after the metal arm snapped in half. The Verak water slide in Kansas City. In the summer of 2014, the Schlitterbahn Kansas City Water Park opened its Guinness World Record-breaking attraction, the Verak water slide. The name means insane or crazy in German. The slide was the world's tallest at the time, at a height of 168 feet, and was designed by John Schooley and co-owner of the park, Jeff Henry. Being taller than Niagara Falls, the almost vertical slide was very popular with tourists. The slide had 2 drops. The first vertical drop was 17 stories high, leading up to an uphill middle section, before the second drop of 5 stories. Riders were sent shooting off down the slide in 3-person rafts. Each raft weighed 100 pounds and was carried up to the top of the ride by a conveyor belt. The riders had to walk up 264 steps to reach the top. Riders were weighed before they climbed the steps and then again at the top to make sure that their combined weight was between 400 and 550 pounds. This was supposed to avoid issues of the raft flying off the slide. After initial testing, alterations were made because the sandbags used would become airborne just before they went down the second drop. The angle of the midsection was changed and a 5-foot length was added so that the raft would slow down before hitting the hump. A sequence of metal hoops and netting was added to the areas where the sandbags had flown off during the tests. On August 7, 2016, 10-year-old Caleb Thomas Swab was enjoying a day out at the park with his brother. Caleb went on the water slide with 2 women. For some reason, he was allowed to sit in the front seat of the raft, and the 2 women sat behind him. It's thought that this uneven weight distribution could have helped to cause the accident. As the raft reached the peak of the uphill section, it lifted off the slide and flew into the metal hoops and netting, hurling Caleb out of his seat, decapitating him and killing him instantly. The 2 women were also injured. One had a broken jaw, and the other suffered from a fractured facial bone and lacerations. The park was closed for an immediate inspection, and although it reopened 3 days later, the water slide remained closed. Engineers inspecting the ride said that the netting was a hazard in itself. It was used in areas where the raft reached speeds of up to 70 miles per hour, so a rider could quite easily lose a limb if they hit it. They also condemned the use of the straps used as restraints, supporting the evidence given by previous riders that their Velcro safety straps had come loose before the ride had even ended. The engineers concluded that a mechanism known as the upstop should have been used to prevent the rafts from becoming airborne, and that rigid over-the-shoulder restraints were needed to secure the riders. In March of 2018, an indictment was issued against the park, and the former operations director Tyler Mills charged them with involuntary manslaughter, aggravated battery, aggravated child endangerment, and interference with law enforcement. The accusations were one of negligence, concealment of design flaws, and covering up injuries that were earlier reported on the ride. Henry and Schooley, the designers of the ride, were charged with second-degree murder as well as 17 other counts. In February of 2019, all charges were dismissed due to inadmissible evidence. Caleb's father was the Kansas State Representative Scott Schwab, and as a consequence, the law regarding self-inspection was changed so that all parks in the state of Kansas now have to be inspected independently. The slide was dismantled in 2018 after a long-running court case, and the Schwab family were awarded $20 million in a settlement. The park did not open for the following year, and both the company's reputation was financially and negatively impacted. The King's Crown, Omaha, Nebraska. The Latino community in South Omaha, Nebraska have been celebrating the Cinco de Mayo festival since the 1920s. In May of 2016, Elizabeth Gilreath, who is also known as Lula, visited the carnival with her family. She went on the King's Crown ride with friends. Riders are seated in one of 4 carriages which spin around in one direction, while the whole ride spins around in the opposite direction. In what was termed to be a freak accident, Lulu's long red hair got caught in the machinery of the ride, and her family could only stand by and watch in horror as she was spun around attached by her hair for several minutes before her entire scalp was ripped away from her head, causing a skull fracture and damage to both of her eyes. Lulu was rushed to hospital in a critical condition where she remained in a coma for quite some time. By 2017, Lulu had undergone 2 head surgeries, 3 skin grafts, 1 eye operation, and 28 blood transfusions, but she has made an incredible recovery. In a statement made a year after the incident, she said, "My scars don't define me. Nobody's scars should define them." An investigation was conducted by the Nebraska Department of Labor. They announced that no portion of the ride failed or malfunctioned, and there was no evidence that the ride operator had failed to carry out sufficient checks or was not paying sufficient attention. What happened to Lulu that day can only be described as a freak accident, which thankfully is very rare. The Superman Tower of Power, Louisville, Kentucky. Situated at what was then the Six Flags Kentucky Kingdom, the Superman was a standard drop tower ride that was installed at 4 Six Flag parks around the United States. The ride had multiple 177-foot drop sections with a seated carriage on each side. Each of these sections had its own cable attached. Riders would sit in a roller coaster style seat facing forward with their feet dangling down unsupported. They were secured with over-the-shoulder restraints and a seatbelt. The carriage would then quickly rise to the top of the tower at 12 miles per hour and be held there for several seconds before being dropped 184 feet at a speed of 54 miles per hour. The carriage was stopped with magnetic brakes just 23 feet above the ground. On the 22nd of June 2007, 13-year-old Caitlin Lassiter had just been on the ride with her 2 friends, and seeing that there was only a small queue, they decided to go on again. The girls were placed in section 3, and this time Caitlin sat on the right outside seat. There were 2 ride operators looking after the Superman that day, and they were both able to see the girls clearly. The first operator checked the girls' restraints, and gave clearance to the controller to start the ride. However, before the carriage had reached the top of the tower, the ride jolted, and Caitlin heard a whipping noise. Both of the operators heard a loud noise too, and saw that the cable for section 3 had snapped. A 130-foot section of this cable was hanging down from the ride. It fell down and hit all of the passengers in section 3 and became tangled in Caitlin's feet. Instead of cutting all power to the ride instantly, the control operator panicked and called the park's emergency number for advice. After a short conversation, she pressed the emergency stop button, but it was too late as the ride had already dropped and had come to a stop in its usual place. Caitlin was sitting in her seat normally, except that both her feet were now missing. They had been severed by the snagged cable as the ride dropped. The first operator ran away, and no one was able to get off the ride because all power had been cut, making it impossible to unlock the restraints. Emergency services arrived, and Caitlin was rushed to hospital. The cable had shattered her left femur and severed both feet as the ride dropped. Doctors were able to save and reattach Caitlin's right foot, although the other had to be amputated below the knee because her left foot was too damaged. A year later, Caitlin was walking again with the help of a prosthetic limb. She had to endure 4 amputations, including one where the bone had grown through the muscle tissue. She sued the park for negligence and was awarded a confidential out-of-court settlement. An inspection of the ride followed by the Kentucky Department of Agriculture revealed that the cable was worn down to just 10.6 millimeters in some places, which was below the standard required by law. Maintenance had not been greasing the cable either. Instead, they had been using cornstarch to stop the ride from slipping. Regardless of mechanical neglect, the passengers would have avoided any major injuries if the control operator had immediately hit the emergency stop button, instead of waiting a whole 10 seconds and allowing the ride to continue its drop. The ride was closed down and new safety measures were put in place at all Six Flags parks. The Superman Tower of Power ride was dismantled before the start of the 2008 summer season. The park was renamed Kentucky Kingdom in 2009, and in 2014, 7 years after the accident, a new tower ride was opened at the park named Fearful. Walt Disney World Resort, Florida. Matt and Melissa Graves had travelled from Nebraska to take their young children, Ela, age 4, and 2-year-old Lane Thomas to Disney World in Florida for a family holiday. They were staying at the Grand Floridian Resort and Spa, which has its own beach area close to the Magic Kingdom. At 9 p.m. on Tuesday the 14th of June, the family were relaxing on the beach known as the Seven Seas Lagoon. The lake is only 15 feet deep and is used for small boats and fishing. The ferry that transports guests to the Magic Kingdom can also be boarded from the lagoon. On the 3rd night of their vacation, Lane was paddling near to the shore and gathering water to make a sandcastle, when suddenly an alligator came up out of the lagoon and grabbed hold of him. His father Matt jumped into the water and tried to pry open the alligator's mouth. Despite his efforts, the creature began to thrash about and it pulled Lane under the water and disappeared. Witnesses said that Lane's mother was frantically running back and forth across the beach as Matt struggled to stop the alligator. Local authorities began an immediate search for the boy using floodlights and sonar equipment, and helicopters used infrared cameras to scan the water. 50 personnel were involved in the operation, including the Florida Wildlife Commission, the Sheriff's Office, and the local fire department. Despite their best efforts, it was 17 hours later when Lane's body was pulled from the lagoon by one of the divers. Whilst the search was going on, wildlife officials caught 5 alligators in the lake, which they euthanized. They said that this was done regularly as part of a wildlife management system, and although an 8-year-old had been bitten in 1986, there had been no further incidents until Lane's death. Although there were no swimming signs close to where the incident occurred, there were no signs that warned of any alligators being present in the water. Florida has more than 1 million alligators in its freshwater lakes, creeks and swamps, but it's very rare for them to attack humans. The Orange County Sheriff's Office said it was likely that the alligator thought Lane was prey and drowned him before leaving his body at the bottom of the lagoon. The Lane family decided not to sue Disney after the incident, saying that they would rather concentrate on the future health of their family. And in 2016, they started the Lane Thomas Foundation in memory of their son. The charity helps to bring awareness to the cause of pediatric organ donation. The foundation supports the parents of children receiving transplants, as well as those who are donating their children's organs. In August of 2017, Disney installed a lighthouse sculpture at Disney World in the hope that it would help to raise awareness for the Lane Thomas Foundation. The gold and blue sculpture was unveiled near the Seven Seas Lagoon beach where Lane was killed. The Lanes have since welcomed a new baby son into their lives, who they named Christian Lane in honour of their son that they lost. Since the incident, warning signs have been put up in the area of Lagoon Beach, and a boulder wall has been built to create a barrier around the edge of the water to protect guests from any further attacks. We've put a link for the Lane Thomas Foundation in the description below. Jazara Thompson. On the night of November 16, 2015, Raquel Thompson went to pick up her boyfriend, Cornell Malone, from work. She left her 4 children alone in the Houston apartment complex where they lived. The children were all under the age of 5, with the youngest child, Jazara, being just 19 months old. On their return 30 minutes later, Thompson and Malone found that the children were still asleep in their beds. At around 10 p.m, they decided to go out again and leave the children unattended, despite the fact that their grandmother lived in the same complex and could have watched them. The couple went to Domino's Pizza, picked up a prescription from a Walgreens pharmacy, and spent some time with Thompson's brother before returning to the apartment at around midnight. They were met by a horrific sight. Jazara was lying on the kitchen floor next to the oven. She was suffering from severe burns. Thompson immediately called the paramedics and began to try and resuscitate her youngest daughter, but it was too late. Jazara died at the scene. After speaking to the other children, police were able to determine that for an unknown reason, the eldest child had decided to put Jazara in the oven, while another turned it on to full. The 3-year-old involved told Child Protective Services that they had put Jazara in the oven and made it hot. Thompson was 7 months pregnant at the time and also had an older child who lived with their father. The family were known to Child Protection Services, although it was not deemed necessary to remove the child before the incident. On the morning of the tragedy, Thompson's ex-boyfriend, Frederick Price, came looking for his children. He claimed to be the father to at least 2 of them, and had not seen them in months because he did not know where they were. He had been trying to find Raquel, and only found out where she was living when he saw it on the news. Price was unsure whether Jazara was his daughter or not, because he had never taken a paternity test, although he did say that she was a cute baby. Despite the involvement of Price and Thompson's mother, the other 3 children were placed in foster care, as it was decided that none of their relatives were suitable to take care of them. Both Thompson and Malone were charged with 4 counts of child endangerment. Later, Thompson was given a 12-year sentence for abandoning a child under the age of 15. Corazon Atienza. Richard Speck was born in Kirkwood, Illinois. He was the 7th of 8 children. Speck's family was extremely religious, and his father died when he was just 6 years old. His mother remarried, and the family relocated to Dallas, Texas. His new stepfather was an alcoholic who mentally abused Speck with threats and insults. Speck began drinking at just 12, and by the age of 15, he too was an alcoholic. He was first arrested at the age of 15 for trespassing, followed by several arrests throughout his teenage years for other misdemeanors. By July of 1966, Richard Speck was now 21 years old and had a criminal record for forgery, burglary, and aggravated assault. But for one reason or another, he always seemed to evade a lengthy sentence. In April of that year, he stayed in Monmouth, Illinois with friends. There, he tied up and raped Virgil Harris, a 65-year-old woman at knife point, after breaking into her house. He was only able to steal a few dollars that she had earned from babysitting that night. A week later, he murdered Mary Pierce, a 32-year-old barmaid, when he hit her so hard in the stomach that she ruptured her liver. He was questioned about the incident by police and told not to leave town, but fled to his sister's apartment in Chicago. After 3 months, it was agreed that he would leave, and he moved to a rooming house. On the night of July 13th, he sexually assaulted 53-year-old Ella Mae Hooper in his room before going to a townhouse in the Jeffrey Manor neighborhood at 11 p.m. The house served as a dormitory for 8 student nurses who worked at the South Chicago Communal Hospital. Wondering who could be knocking on the door so late, 23-year-old Corazon, or Cora as she was known to her friends, went to answer it. She found a tall young man standing there. He was dressed all in black, had a pock-marked face, and his hair was greasy and slicked back. The man smelled strongly of drink, and he pushed his way past Cora and into the house. With the threat of a knife and the gun stolen from Ella Mae, Speck herded all of the women together into one room. He promised that he would not hurt them, and said he just needed money to get to New Orleans. Speck then proceeded to systematically remove each nurse from the room before sexually assaulting them and stabbing and strangling them one by one. All of the women were killed that night, and were aged between just 20 and 24 years old. Unbeknown to Speck, there was another girl at the house that night. Although he had pushed past her at the door, Speck failed to notice that Cora was missing from the room. She had crawled under one of the beds and hidden there whilst the horror was taking place. Too afraid to move and barely daring to even breathe, Cora stayed in her hiding place until 6 a.m. long after Speck had fled the scene. She then climbed out to the window ledge of the bedroom and began to scream for help. 3 days later, Speck was taken to Cook County Hospital after he had tried to commit suicide. The doctor who treated him had just been on a break and had read a newspaper that showed a photograph of the killer. The doctor also recognized a tattoo that matched the newspaper's description. Although terrified, Cora was brave enough to walk over to Speck and identify him in court. She was kept under police protection for a year before the trial and learned to play poker with the police detectives that guarded her. Speck was found guilty of 8 counts of murder and sentenced to death, although this was later commuted to a jail term of between 400 and 1,200 years. After the trial, Cora moved back to the Philippines, where she married before returning to the US and working in Washington, D.C. as a critical care nurse. She has 2 children and 6 grandchildren, and appreciates every day that she is alive. Cora moved on with her life, and has tried to be happy every day. Cora wonders why she was spared, but believes there was somebody up there who was hiding her from Speck, stating that God was so nice, although she will never forget her friends that died or the horror of that night. She still has nightmares that he will come back and kill her, even though Speck died in prison from a heart attack in 1991. A truly tragic story. Barbara Foster. In February 2017, emergency services were called to an address in Lucas County, Ohio, when people walking past the house began to complain about the smell of excrement. Firefighters had to wear hazmat suits before they could enter the house of Barbara Foster, who was 75. Although neighbours in the local area of Springfield Township said they looked out for one another, the man who had lived next door to Barbara for a decade admitted he had not seen her for years. He said he used to wave to her regularly, and she was known around town as a hoarder and recluse. A man from Barbara's local church had visited regularly, bringing food parcels for years. He said that he didn't even notice the stench anymore, because he had just become accustomed to it, although the emergency services said that the smell was overpowering. He noticed that Barbara was in low spirits and feeling unwell, so he called 911. The firefighters were shocked to find Barbara, who was 5'5" and weighed 550 pounds, stuck in an armchair. She had been sitting there for months and was surrounded by a pile of her own feces and urine. Apparently, she had been unable to move for 7 months. When the emergency services were unable to get her out of the chair, they noticed that her skin had become fused to it and had grown over the fabric. She had become molded to the armchair. Mrs. Foster had become so physically weak that her bones began to break as the emergency services tried to lift her from the chair. The house was condemned as being unfit for habitation because of the human waste found there. Barbara was taken to the University of Toledo Medical Center, but she later died. After a review of the case, the Lucas County Sheriff's Office decided that no crime had been committed, and the case was considered closed. Spider House, Missouri. In October of 2007, Brian and Susan Trost found their dream home. Their new house overlooked the exclusive Whitmore Country Club golf course in Weldon Springs, Missouri. With 2,400 square feet of space and 4 bedrooms, the house cost the couple $450,000. After moving in, Susan Trost noticed that there were a lot of spider webs in the property, especially around the light fittings and in the basement, but she decided that the house just needed a thorough clean. But it soon became apparent that the house was infested when the family began finding spiders everywhere, hanging from ceilings and lights and crawling up blinds and in fireplaces. One night when Susan was taking a shower, one even dropped from the ceiling and just missed landing in her hair before it was swept down the drain. The spiders were literally seeping out of the wall cavities. The Trost caught one of the spiders, and after doing some research on the net, they realized that they were dealing with a brown recluse. These spiders are from the same species as the black widow and use necrotic venom when biting their prey. Symptoms from a bite can be as mild as pain, swelling and itching at the puncture site, as well as nausea. Organ failure or death has been reported in extreme cases. By 2012, the problem had gotten so bad that an expert from the University of Kansas estimated that the Trosts were sharing their home with between 4,500 and 6,000 spiders, and that was just during the winter season. 2 extermination companies sprayed behind the drywall, placed pesticide in the attic area, and laid traps, but were unable to eradicate the spiders. The Tross filed a claim with their insurance company and took up a lawsuit against the vendors who had sold the property to them without disclosing the spider problem. The previous owners stated that they never saw any spiders, and their lawyer insinuated that the Tross had unbeknowingly brought the spiders into the homes themselves. Nevertheless, the civil trial jury voted in the Tross' favour, and the couple were awarded over $470,000 in compensation. But the former owners claimed bankruptcy, so none of the money was ever paid. The insurance company refused to pay, stating that the spiders had not caused any physical damage within the home. So, fearing for the safety of their 4 children, the Tross felt that they had no other option other than to leave what was once their dream home. They left their furniture outside in freezing temperatures before the move in the hope that that would kill any spiders that were hiding in there. The house went into foreclosure in 2014 after being left empty for 2 years, and the mortgage company employed a pest control firm to deal with the problem. The house was covered in 9 tarpaulins, which measured over 15,000 square feet, before being filled with a poisonous sulfury chloride gas. This gas was able to permeate the walls and kill both the spiders and their eggs. Apparently, the earlier attempts to eradicate the swarm did not work because pesticides do not kill spiders, as their feet are unable to absorb substances. Arachnid experts have no idea why the spiders chose to infest that particular house without invading any others in the area. The Tross neighbours reported that they had never had any problems with spiders in their homes, although bugs can be unknowingly carried into the home from other places, such as in furniture bought at auction or brought from storage. Any items of furniture that are introduced in that way should be thoroughly checked first. But can you just imagine sharing your home with up to 6,000 spiders? Pedro Alonso Lopez. Pedro Alonso Lopez shared a familiar trait, common to a lot of serial killers. He had a horrific childhood. He was born in 1948 in Santa Isabel, Colombia, and was a middle child of 13. His father, Madaro Reese, was a supporter of a right-wing party, and he was killed during the first year of Colombia's 10-year civil war, known as La Violencia. His mother, Benilda, was 3 months pregnant with Lopez at the time. From an early age, Lopez watched his mother perform sex acts for money, and often witnessed her being assaulted by clients. Lopez claimed his mother was also physically abusive. Obviously affected by this trauma, he was caught indecently touching one of his sisters when he was just 8 years old, so his mother threw him out to wander the streets. He made his way towards the capital city of Bogota, where he joined the many other street children, or gamies, who searched out food in Bogota's refuse bins. Lopez joined a gang and began smoking a highly addictive form of cocaine known as bazuco. Lopez claims he was abducted and raped by a man during this time. At the age of 10, he was helped by an American family who took him in and were able to get him enrolled in a school for orphans. But at age 12, he was sexually assaulted by a teacher, so he ran away. Now on the streets again, by the age of 18, he was arrested for stealing cars. In prison, he was gang raped, but he hunted each rapist down and killed them, one by one, using an improvised knife known as a shiv. After his release from prison, Lopez traveled to Peru, where he began to lure young girls to remote areas, where he would assault and murder them. By 1978, he had killed at least 100 girls between the ages of 9 and 12. He said, "I walked among the market searching for a girl with a certain look on her face, a look of innocence and beauty. She would be a good girl. I followed her for 2 or 3 days, waiting for the moment when she was left alone." He was caught trying to kidnap a 9-year-old girl by members of the indigenous Ayacucho community. They submitted him to tribal law, and he was sentenced to be buried alive. But a missionary convinced the tribe to turn him over to the Peruvian police. He did not stand trial. Instead, he was deported back to Colombia, where he was able to continue his killings. By the late 1970s, Lopez had gone to Ecuador, and by 1980, in the Ambato province, dozens of young girls were missing, and the locals were desperately trying to find out what was happening to them. Lopez later claimed that by this point, he was killing around 3 girls every week. He said that Ecuadorian girls were more gentle and trusting, more innocent. He was finally caught again when he tried to lure the daughter of Kalina Raman from a busy marketplace, and the stall holders were able to surround and detain him. Once in custody, Lopez refused to cooperate. He was tricked by an undercover police officer who posed as an inmate. Lopez confessed to the murders and gave a detailed account of the burial site. Because of this information, police found over 50 bodies, and coupled with the confession, Lopez was charged with 110 murders, to which he pleaded guilty. He was assessed by psychiatrists and officially diagnosed as a sociopath. In 1981, he was found guilty of only 3 of the murders, although he had confessed to over 300 sexual assaults and strangulations. Shockingly, Lopez only received a maximum sentence of 16 years in prison because of Ecuadorian law. Lopez served time at the Garcia Moreno prison in Quito for just 14 years before he was released for good behavior. In 1994, he was once again deported to Colombia. He was declared insane and detained at a psychiatric hospital in Bogota. After being declared sane in 1998, he was released under conditional bail of just $50. Lopez, known as the Monster of the Andes, absconded, and at present his whereabouts are unknown. A Guinness World Record listing that declared him the world's most prolific serial killer has since been removed, as it was declared that the entry was making a competition out of a murderer. Pedro Alonso Lopez, a man who killed over 100 people, if still alive, is walking the streets to this day. K-141 Kursk. During the Cold War, the US fleet of aircraft carriers was a huge concern for the Soviet Union. They were seen as a double threat, a transport platform able to launch nuclear weapons at the USSR, and a hunter of the motherland's own nuclear missile fleet. The Soviet solution was to design an anti-class of submarine capable of killing large ships, especially aircraft carriers. They were nicknamed Oscar II by NATO. At its widest point, the Oscar IIs measured almost 60 feet and were 508 feet long, twice as long as a destroyer. They were powered by 2 OK-650 nuclear reactors, meaning that they were able to reach speeds of up to 33 knots, because of a shipboard horsepower of 97,990. But they needed to be big, because each sub carried 24 P-700 Granite missiles. Each one weighed 15,400 pounds, with a length of 33 feet, the size of a small plane. A Granite had a maximum speed of Mach 1.6, a range of 388 miles, and carried a 500 kiloton warhead, meaning that an aircraft carrier would be evaporated with just one hit. The USSR built 13 Oscar I and IIs, including K-141, which was named Kursk, after the Russian city. Completed in 1994, she was allocated to the Northern Fleet. On the 12th of August 2000, the Kursk was taking part in a major training exercise in the Barents Sea with the Soviet aircraft carrier Admiral Kuznetsov and the battle cruiser Pyotr Veletsky. The Kursk was to feign an attack on the battle cruiser by firing dummy torpedoes. Suddenly, at 11:28 AM, there was a huge underwater explosion followed closely by an even larger one. It's believed that the explosion happened because one of the blank hydrogen peroxide fueled torpedoes failed. The first blast measured 2.2 on the Richter scale and was equivalent to 220 to 550 pounds of TNT. The second was equivalent to 3 to 7 tons and blew sizable shards of debris back through the sub. She sank vertically at a 20-degree angle in what was fairly shallow water at 354 feet. There were 118 men on board, but not all of them were killed right away. Lieutenant Captain Dmitry Kolnikov wrote a note that was dated 2 hours after the explosion. It said that 23 men had survived and had taken refuge in the 9th compartment of the sub. Despite help from both British and Norwegian rescue units, time ran out for the survivors. Sadly, all 111 crew members, 5 officers and 2 engineers died. In 2001, a Dutch-led team raised the Kursk and recovered the remains of 115 sailors. Their bodies were returned to Russia for burial. The USS Scorpion. The Scorpion was built at the Electric Boat Shipyard in Connecticut, USA during the summer of 1960. She belonged to the Skipjack class of nuclear submarines, a groundbreaking type of sub that had a streamlined shaped hull to maximize speed underwater and be capable of fast attack. The Scorpion was one of 19 nuclear subs from the Atlantic Fleet. She was based at Naval Station Norfolk in Virginia, headquarters of the US Navy's Fleet Forces Command. The demands of the Cold War meant that the US Navy's nuclear submarines were in constant service in the job of finding and stalking Soviet subs. This continual use had a damaging effect on the Scorpion. Her machinery suffered from serious oil leaks, and her propeller shaft seal deteriorated, causing seawater seepage. The Scorpion was restricted to a depth of no more than 300 feet. While in 1967, she began to experience severe vibrations, although the cause was never established. The crew started to call her the Scrap Iron. In February of 1968, despite needing a serious renovation, the Scorpion was sent on one last deployment to the Mediterranean for a joint NATO exercise. The crew were able to enjoy some shore leave in Italy and Spain on their 3-month posting, before returning to Norfolk at the end of May. The Scorpion left the port of Rota, Spain, on the 28th of April. After leaving the Mediterranean, she headed west across the Atlantic. Her estimated time of arrival was 1 p.m. on the 27th of May, although this original schedule was changed on the 17th of May. A group of Soviet warships was spotted off the coast of Africa, and the Scorpion was sent 1,000 miles southwest towards the Canary Islands to see what they were up to. At the Submarine Forced Atlantic Message Center in Norfolk, all incoming and outgoing messages were processed for all subs serving with the Atlantic Fleet. Top-secret encryption machines would take messages and scramble them into indecipherable nonsense. This random text was sent in Morse code via high-frequency radio to the subs at sea. All incoming messages were taken already encrypted and broken using the same machines. Like all submarines out at sea, the Scorpion was scheduled to communicate an encrypted check report every 24 hours. This meant that headquarters would know that the situation was normal and everything was proceeding as planned. The Scorpion's orders were to send a broadcast once a day that read Check 24 Submarine Scorpion. While on the 22nd of May, no transmission was recorded, the USS Scorpion had disappeared. 5 days later, the families of her crew members were waiting in vain for her return at Norfolk. In the Navy's Situation Room at the Pentagon, concerned officers were trying to work out where the Scorpion could be. It was established that she had to be somewhere along the 3,300-mile Great Circle route between Gibraltar and Norfolk. Perhaps the crew was still alive on board and struggling to correct some sort of mechanical failure, or the scenario that was becoming more and more likely was that she could be down. Either way, she needed to be found. An air-sea search was deemed futile. The sub was probably at a depth where it would not be seen from the air. So the chief civilian scientist of the Special Projects Division, John Craven, offered to help. In 1966, a B-52 bomber collided with a jet tanker on the Spanish coast. 3 70-kiloton hydrogen bombs had been dropped near the town of Palomares. Craven had found the H-bomb that had fallen into the sea by calculating its position using an obscure mathematical theorem. Now, in order to find the missing submarine, Craven started by studying the readouts of the underwater hydrophones in Newfoundland and the Canary Islands. He found between 5 and 8 underwater explosions at about the same time that the Scorpion was in the middle of the Atlantic. Craven knew that the water there was 11,000 feet deep, so there was little chance of survival. Nevertheless, he persisted, and by using estimates of the Scorpion's speed and course, and comparing them with the acoustic anomalies, she was eventually located. On the 29th of October, the oceanographic research vessel Mizar found the Scorpion on the seafloor. She had been torn apart, and all 99 crew members were dead. In a final report issued by the Navy Board of Inquiries, all reasons suggested for the accident involved some form of equipment failure, although Craven believes that it was caused by a fatal torpedo exploding in the hull. To this day, the exact cause of the disaster is unknown. Ming 361. Submarine number 361 was a Type 035 Ming-class diesel-electric submarine belonging to the People's Republic Army Navy known as Plan. She was a more advanced Ming-3 model, so had the ability to fire guided torpedoes at opposing subs. 361 was entered into service in 1995 and was one of China's North Sea Fleet 12th Submarine Brigade. On the 25th of April 2003, a periscope was spotted in the Yellow Sea by the crew of a fishing boat. Plan was notified and they sent 2 vessels to carry out an investigation. It was first thought that the sub was from Japan or South Korea, but the Chinese soon established that the submarine was in fact one of their own, the Ming-class 361. The next day, whilst aboard the sub, all 70 crew members were found dead. They were still sitting at their stations as though they had just fallen asleep, apparently suffocated to death. On May the 2nd, a statement was made by the military commissioner and former president Jiang Zemin. He honoured the sacrifice made by the Chinese submarine crew, although he was pretty vague about the cause of the incident, citing some form of mechanical failure. An inquiry was carried out, and a month later, both the commander and commissioner of the North Sea Fleet were dismissed, as well as 8 other officers. The reason for the removal was cited as improper command and control. The Chinese government does not publish any results from its military investigations, and it was surprising that they chose to acknowledge this incident at all. 361 was on a naval exercise east of Beijing in the Yellow Sea and practicing silent running. This is the operating procedure used by the crew to make the submarine undetectable. For this reason, she was maintaining radio silence, and Plan did not realize that there was a problem. It is unknown how 361 was recovered and what happened to cause the death of her crew. There were 70 men on board, which is unusual as a typical company would be 55 to 57. It was also strange that a high-ranking Commodore was on board. This has led to a theory that 361 was not on a routine mission. One theory is that the extra crew members were on board to observe tests of a new air-independent propulsion system. Another theory claims that the sub was leaking and seawater mixed with battery acid allowed chlorine gas to form and poison the crew. Yet another claims that the sub was on a dangerous exercise that caused her to end up nose down and stuck on the seabed. Although the reason that is most generally accepted for the deaths of the crew is use of the diesel engine. If the sub was snorkeling just below the surface of the water and an air intake valve closed but the engine did not shut down in response, then the motor would have used up the air supply in under 2 minutes. Any one of these explanations would reflect badly on both the training of the crew and the mechanical operation of the sub, neither of which would be acceptable to the Chinese government. And thus we are left with unanswered questions surrounding Ming 361 and the fate of her crew. K-152 Nerpa. The Nerpa was an Akula-class nuclear-powered attack submarine. The Russian-made sub was commissioned in 1993, but her construction was suspended for almost 10 years because of a lack of money. In 2004, the Indian Navy funded her build and trials on the condition that she would be leased to them at a later date. There were further delays, and the Nerpa was not launched for sea trials until October 2008. There was criticism over her construction and the quality of the metal used. It was alleged that the Nerpa took on water during her first tests, as her seams were not sealed properly. On November the 8th, the Nerpa was in Pita, the Great Gulf, at the Russian Pacific Fleet testing range. Her tests were being supervised by a team from the Imirsky shipbuilding plant. This meant that there were far more people on board than was usual. There were 208 in total, including 127 civilian engineers, as well as 81 military personnel. Every compartment on a Russian sub contains a fire suppressant system. During the sub's first underwater test run, at 8:30 p.m, the Nerpa's fire extinguishing system was activated. This sealed off 2 front compartments and filled them with Freon gas. Freon displaces oxygen, allowing it to smother fires quickly in confined spaces. In extreme amounts, it can cause mental confusion, lethargy, narcosis, and ultimately death by asphyxiation. Sadly, 20 people were killed in the accident and 41 people were injured, many of them with frostbite because of the freezing effect of the gas. The destroyer, Admiral Tributz, was sent to assist the submarine, and the injured were transferred to military hospitals to be treated. The NERPA was not damaged in the accident and had normal radiation levels. 3 days later, a statement was issued by the Russian Navy that a crewman named Dmitry Grobov had turned on the fire suppressant system without permission. He was charged and faced imprisonment. Fellow crew members expressed skepticism, believing that Grobov was being used as a scapegoat. The suppression system on board was a new type which had never been used on a submarine before. It could work in both manual and automatic modes, and was triggered by smoke or a rise in temperature. According to one engineer, it had already malfunctioned when still at the shipyard. A government package was put together to compensate the families of the victims. On January 4, 2012, the NERPA was handed over to the Indian Navy for a 10-year lease. The sub was renamed INS Chakra II, and the deal was said to have cost over $900 million. HMS Thetis. Her Majesty's submarine Thetis was built at the Camel Laird shipyard in Birkenhead, England. She was a 270-foot T-class submarine belonging to the Royal Navy. The T-class were designed in the 1930s and were diesel-electric. They played a major role in the Navy's submarine operations during the Second World War, with 53 of them being built just before the outbreak in 1939. She was named for the Greek goddess of water and mother of the hero Achilles. The Thetis was launched on the 29th of June, 1938. In April of the following year, she was sent on her first sea trials for engine and steering. It was found that her steering gear had been connected wrongly. When ordered to swing port, she would go starboard, and vice versa. It was odd that this obvious mistake had not been detected earlier. There should have been diving trials in Garlock, Scotland, which was the usual site for such tests. But because this preliminary run through the forward hydroplanes jammed into the hard-to-dive position and could not be changed, this caused the diving trials to be postponed. The Thetis was returned to dry dock in order that extra work could be carried out on her. When the Thetis left Birkenhead for what was to be her final diving trial, she was carrying 103 souls. There were her normal crew of 59 men, as well as other technical observers and 9 Royal Navy officers. The complement also included 2 caterers from Liverpool, who were to provide sandwiches, pies and beers. She was led out by the tug, Grebecock, owned by the Liverpool Screw Towing and Lightridge Company. The tug was to be an escort for the Thetis during the trial. She was also there to take the passengers on board before the Thetis made her first dive. Grebecock swung her boats out and offered them to the passengers, but they all refused, wanting to stay aboard the Thetis and experience a submarine dive firsthand. At 2 p.m, Commander Guy Bolus signalled that the dive would commence and the Thetis would remain submerged for 3 hours. The crew of the tugboat heard the loud whooshing sound as the main vents on the Thetis were opened, but it took her almost 50 minutes to actually disappear below the water. Then, just before 3 p.m, she suddenly went under. After 15 minutes, the Thetis was supposed to surface and then re-dive. This time was long past, and the crew of the tugboat realised that something was wrong. But the tug was positioned half a mile away, and unfortunately her anchor had not been deployed, so the Grebecock had continued to drift 4 miles further away from the diving area, finally losing sight of the position of where the Thetis had submerged. The tugboat sent a signal for support. Now it was starting to go dark, and the position of the Thetis was unknown. It was later discovered that when the torpedo tubes on board the submarine were coated with the bitumen, a tiny test cock hole had been blocked, and this is what led to the disaster. It seems incredible that such a small mistake could cause so much devastation. On board, a decision was made to empty the after tubes in order to raise the stern. This worked, and the stern rose until it was sticking 18 feet out of the water, but the escape hatch was 20 feet below the sea. There was no point in trying to escape until a rescue craft was directly above the hatch. Throughout the night, rescue teams searched desperately for the Thetis until 7:45, a plane noticed her stern out of the water. She had been underwater for 18 hours. Those on board were very weak because of a lack of oxygen. On the first rescue attempt, 2 men died, but another 4 were saved with the use of breathing apparatus. Cables were attached to hold the sub, but as a third attempt of rescue was made, for some unknown reason, HMS Thetis flooded with water, and all those left on board were lost. The weight of the water caused the cables to snap, and the submarine sank to the bottom of the seabed. Months later, a diver was killed because of a severe bend during the recovery attempt, although Thetis was raised and beached. All of the bodies recovered were buried together at Holyhead in a mass grave. Quezon City Jail, Manila, Philippines. Rodrigo the Punisher Duterte became president of the Philippines in June 2016 and is known for his tough attitude towards crime. He is quoted as saying that suspected criminals should be shot on sight. There have been reports that he was personally responsible for the killing of criminal suspects when he was the mayor of Davao City. Once he was elected president, one of his earliest policies was to launch a war on drugs. During his first 6 weeks in office, the police arrested more than 2,200 suspects, and they all needed to be held somewhere. The city of Quezon is the most populated city in the Philippines and one of 16 cities in the Metro Manila area. It is here, in an inconspicuous neighborhood, that Quezon Jail stands just across from the library and around the corner from the police station. The jail isn't particularly large. It has an area of just over 30,000 square feet and was built to house 800 people. UN guidelines state that it should house no more than 278. By August 2016, there were 3,800 people in the jail, with 60% being held on drug charges. That's more than 5 times more people than it was originally designed for, and yet the authorities were still accepting up to 30,000 prisoners per day. All inmates are made to wear yellow t-shirts. In some of the dormitories, they were meant to house just 30 men. There are up to 131 adult males, and bunks are stacked 3 high. The men call the dorms barangays, which means neighborhood in Filipino. Towels and curtains are used to try and give a little privacy, but it's pointless in such a confined space. The jail is so crowded that every single inch of the floor space is used. Men even lie body to body in concrete stairwells, and some have to sleep either sitting or standing. There are up to 130 men per toilet, and the stench is overwhelming. Insanitary diseases such as sepsis and tuberculosis are common, as are skin infections and diarrhea. There is little to no medical care, and the heat is unbearable and suffocating. Many men have died from heat stroke. Prisoners wake at 6 AM, followed by a national flag raising ceremony, then morning exercise consists of singing and dancing. Participation in these sessions earn prisoners points, which can shorten their sentences. As you can imagine, tensions run high, and there is often violence between the prisoners, and there are only 20 guards on duty per shift. Visitors wait for hours before being given a hand stamp and then left to mingle with the inmates, as there is no designated visiting area. Most of the prisoners are involved in trials that could take years because the courts are so congested. There is a shortage of judges and prosecutors, so there may only be 2 or 3 hearings a year. Many would leave the jail if they could afford the bail money, but in this area of poverty, finding a payment, which may be as low as $100, is impossible for many. You don't want to end up in any prisons, but this one especially, and we've only gotten started on the list. Heilongjiang Women's Prison in China. Heilongjiang Province is located in the northeastern part of the People's Republic of China, sharing borders with both Russia and Mongolia. Falun Gong is a mind and body religion that has been persecuted by the governing Chinese Communist Party since 1999. People know the risks involved, but have found that practicing Falun Gong has helped them to recover from both physical and mental illness. The religion teaches you how to become a good person through the principles of truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance. One elderly woman named Mrs. Zhao was from the province capital of Harbin City. She became a follower of Falun Gong in 1996. Mrs. Zhao was arrested for promoting Falun Gong when posting leaflets about the religion on the streets of Harbin. She was given a mock trial at a detention centre where she was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment. The area is renowned for its long, harsh winters, so Mrs. Zhao and others were punished by being forced to stand outside in the freezing snow with no jackets or trousers. They were kept outside like this, given hardly any food or water, and had no toilet breaks for 7 days. The authorities also motivate other inmates into persecuting practitioners of Falun Gong by offering them lighter sentences if they mistreated followers. So one inmate used a bamboo stick to hit Mrs. Zhao's frostbitten hands. She was regularly beaten and placed in solitary confinement by the guards for refusing to denounce her beliefs. Sometimes she was hung in a stressed position with her hands handcuffed behind her back for days at a time. Another prison reported that she and other Falun Gong followers were forced to get up at 5 AM every day, sit on a tiny stool and watch propaganda videos. The videos ridiculed and condemned the religion of Falun Gong in an attempt to brainwash them. Sitting on the small hard stools for long periods of time caused pressure sores that were extremely painful. Other inmates were encouraged to torment the practitioners by following them everywhere and stealing their food and possessions. Some were even given electric batons to use whenever they saw fit. Most sinister of all are the reports of women being held down so that blood can be drawn from their arms in order to build up a database for organ transplant surgery. The Chinese authorities have been accused of using Falun Gong followers for forced organ harvesting at the prison. La Santé prison in Paris. La Santé is in the Montparnasse district of Paris. It is now the only main prison within the Paris area and is renowned for having high security and VIP wings. It was considered as an example of reform and humanity when it was built in the 1860s. Although in the early 20th century, executions by guillotine were held just outside of the prison gates. During the Nazi occupation of France, 18 resistant fighters and communists were guillotined at Santé. The last public beheading there was in 1939. Until the year 2000, the prison was divided into 4 blocks that were categorized by the inmates' ethnicity. Block A contained Western European men. Block B were Black African, Block C were North African, and Block D were from the rest of the world. Another unusual feature of Santé is the special area where convicted personalities are imprisoned. Many notorious felons have been imprisoned there, including notable politicians, actors, and journalists. In early January of 2000, Dr. Veronique Vasseur published a damning book highlighting the atrocious conditions that she had witnessed when working within Santé. She treated men suffering from such depression or mental illness that they had swallowed rat poison, drain cleaner, or even forks. Self-harming was rampant, as was attempted suicide. Instead of being treated with compassion, any suicidal men were chained up for their own protection. In 1999, there were 124 suicides in just 1 year, comparable to 24 in the whole of the Californian prison system. In France, as in many other countries, suspects can be jailed indefinitely without trial. This means that some men have spent months in the jail before a magistrate suddenly decided that there is not enough evidence to bring charges and the prisoner is freed. Some of these men are forced to share a cell with others who have already been sentenced for their crimes. Vasseur reported that men were locked up 4 to a cell, and that even though summer temperatures inside the prison could rise up to 100 degrees, they were only allowed out for 4 hours a day. Cells are only 30 feet square and have solid metal doors with a small peephole, making it impossible to see what is happening within the room. Men who have prison jobs such as sorting labels or assembling small devices are often made to work in their cells, having no more than 2 square meters of room to themselves. Prisoners tried to hold the rats and mice back by stuffing any cracks in their cells with clothing. Mattresses were infested with lice and other bugs such as cockroaches. Prisoners had collected them in jars in a show of protest. Bullying was systematic, and many of the more vulnerable men had become nothing more than slaves to their cellmates. The culture of rape was extremely worrying when it was revealed that about 10% of the population were HIV positive. Dr. Vasseur found that at least a third of the men were addicted to some kind of drug, which ranged from cocaine to much stranger mixtures, such as water in which batteries had been boiled. Many guards were found to be corrupt and involved in the trafficking of drugs, as well as the systematic abuse of prisoners. Reports were made of a guard who regularly put inmates into cells close to the laundry if they suffered from lung disease, just so that the humidity would aggravate their condition. Empty cells further away would be available, but the guards refused to move the inmates, preferring to let them suffer. Some guards even forced inmates into performing sexual acts. The food fed to prisoners was often rotten, and there were many cases of stomach flu and diarrhea. Dr. Vasseur was able to detect trench foot and a little-known skin disease known as bread scabies, which was rife during the harsh conditions of World War II. In 2014, 3 blocks of the prisoners were closed for renovations, and the prisoners had been transferred. During this period, Santé was open to the public for tours. Ironically, when translated into English, Santé means health. The Penitentiary of Mendoza, Argentina. Mendoza Penitentiary lies in the central western area of the province of Mendoza, Argentina. In 2004, the prison was reported to be holding 2,400 men in a building built for just 600. Some cells are just 5 square meters, and up to 5 prisoners have to sleep on the floor without mattresses. Sometimes the men are locked up for 24 hours a day without any exercise, and there is little natural light and no fresh air within the prison. It's hard to tell the difference between the toilet facilities and the cells, because the whole area is flooded by sewage. Infections are commonplace, and there have been widespread cases of meningitis and tuberculosis. There is no access to baths or showers, and inmates are only able to use a hose if they want to wash themselves. This lack of personal hygiene has caused many cases of scabies and other insanitary skin diseases in the jail. Dehydration is also a problem because there is not enough fresh drinking water. The inmates are forced to urinate in plastic bottles and defecate in plastic bags in front of one another. The waste is then just left in the cells. There are no medical records held for the inmates, and medication is limited. Men that are in need of medical attention often self-harm just so that they will be seen by someone. Although doctors hardly ever enter the prison and are usually only called after an inmate has died, and even though there are many deaths in the prison, hardly any of them are ever investigated. The guards regularly allow groups of police officers into the prison. The officers wear masks and bring trained attack dogs with them, then randomly beat inmates, torture and terrorize them with the dogs. There is no access to any kind of study or work that could lead to rehabilitation, and the men are not allowed to take part in any religious services. There is no separation between prisoners who have already been sentenced and ones who are awaiting trial. Up to 60% of all people in prison in Argentina are in pre-trial detention. Some have been held there for as long as 6 years. There is no structure in place to separate the types of criminals either, so a mass murderer may be placed in a cell with someone who's committed money fraud. 14 inmates sewed their mouths shut as a form of protest, all of which were below the age of 21. This action, along with several riots, have highlighted the problems and brought them to the attention of human rights groups. But as of 2008, violence from both guards and inmates continues in prisons across Argentina, and today there have been very little updates. The National Penitentiary Office reported that there were 301 cases of ill treatment and torture in just a 6-month period between January and June of 2018. Tadmor military prison in Syria. In the middle of the Homs Desert, about 200 miles northeast of Damascus, is the ancient city of Palmyra, called Tadmor in Arabic. It is a desert oasis that has been described by UNESCO as an area of outstanding universal value, and is also known as the Pearl of the Desert. But Palmyra was also the site of a monstrous prison, once called a Kingdom of Death and Madness. Originally a military barracks, Tadmor prison was built by the French in the 1930s. After Syrian independence, it was later used to house military prisoners and was thought to hold political detainees from as early as 1966. From 1971 to the year 2000, Syria was ruled by the Syrian dictator Hafez al-Assad, and it was during this time that the prison got its reputation as a place of torture and death. Members of the Muslim Brothers, as well as communists and other left-wing parties who opposed Assad's regime, were held at Tadmor. In the decade between the 80s and 90s, more than 20,000 people were imprisoned, causing huge overcrowding. Some dorms were so packed that prisoners had to take it in turns to sleep whilst others stood. If inmates from other prisons refused to sign a statement of loyalty to the state, then they were sent to Tadmor prison indefinitely after their original sentence had ended. The prison building was circular in its construction so that guards were able to constantly watch all of the prisoners simultaneously. There were 7 courtyards with about 50 dormitories and 39 smaller cells. There were also 19 underground bunkers, where prisoners were placed into solitary confinement as a form of discipline. No visitors were allowed, reading and writing was forbidden, as was any other form of entertainment or work. The slow passage of time was seen as a type of punishment in itself. Inmates were not allowed to raise their eyes and look at the faces of the guards. On arrival, the captives were taken to a reception party in a courtyard where they were forced to drink sewage water. Then they would be suspended from a tire, and the soles of their feet would be beaten with sticks and cables, before being removed from the tire and forced to run around the courtyard. During this time, they would be continually whipped. Some of the prisoners died during this reception. Other forms of torture included the metal German chair, to which a prisoner would have had their arms and legs secured. The back of the chair is then pulled down, causing the victim's torso to bend over backwards. As well as causing breathing difficulties, this can fracture vertebrae, and also cause the skin to split open because it's stretched so badly. Many former prisoners have since recounted their time spent in Tadmor in memoirs and poetry. In one, a journal described how guards would hold them in the stress positions and whip them or randomly beat inmates to death. One elderly detainee was ordered to lick a guard's boots before he was beaten. Another was used as a human trampoline before the guard jumped on his neck, killing him. One inmate was ordered to swallow a dead mouse, whole, who survived but was subsequently sent insane. Sometimes a guard would deliberately drop a concrete block onto the head of a prisoner walking in the courtyard from the outlook tower above. Some were forced to eat insects, whilst others were often starved to death. On June 26, 1980, President Assad was waiting to greet an African dignitary outside the guest palace in Damascus. Suddenly there was gunfire and a grenade landed at his feet. He managed to kick it away successfully escaping the assassination attempt. As revenge for this, Assad's brother, Rifat, who ran the Syrian security forces, sent 60 Syrian soldiers to Tadmor by helicopter at dawn the next day. The soldiers were split into squads and ordered to kill every prisoner on sight. It's thought that there could have been as many as 2,400 men killed that day. This was meant to serve as a warning from all Syrians to stay in line. In May 2015, Palmyra was captured by militants from the Islamic State of Iraq and Levant known as ISIL. They released several propaganda videos from inside the walls of Tadmor before blowing the prison up, along with several ancient sites of historical importance. Sadly, there are no records of the prisoners who were held in or died at Tadmor prison. The mysterious disappearance of little Pauline Pickard. In April 1922, 2-year-old Pauline Pickard disappeared whilst playing outside her home in the village of Goas al-Ludi in the region of Brittany in northwest France. Her frantic parents gathered the locals, who searched the family farm and surrounding area for clues to Pauline's whereabouts. But despite around 150 people joining the search, they turned up nothing. Pauline's family feared she had wandered off and either died of cold or was eaten by a wild animal. Although it was strange, no trace of such an attack or the little girl's body was found. Rumours started to spread through the village that Pauline had been abducted by a chimney sweep who had recently visited the area. Others speculated she had been stolen by passing travellers or by 2 strangers that had been spotted loitering around the Pickard's farm at the time of Pauline's disappearance. However, despite extensive inquiries and searches by the police and volunteers, no trace could be found. Then about a month later, the police arrived at the Pickard's farm carrying a photograph of a little girl who had been found wandering alone in the city of Cherbourg, over 200 miles away. A few days before the girl was found, she was seen with a scruffy woman who had tried to leave the child in a store before being chased down by the owner, who gave the child back. Pauline's parents looked at the photo and were relieved to see it was their little girl, and her mother burst into tears, saying, "That's my daughter." Not long after, they boarded a train to Cherbourg, excited to be reunited with Pauline and bring her home. However, when they first saw her, they were not convinced it was their daughter. The girl didn't recognize them, and their unusually chatty daughter didn't say a word. When they spoke to her in their Breton language, she appeared not to understand. The parents spent a few days with the girl and were soon convinced she was in fact Pauline. When asked by reporters if they were sure, the father replied, "Of course, she has the same hair and the same blue eyes." The girl was allowed to leave with the Pickards, and doctors hoped that once she was home, her normal surroundings would spark her memory and get her talking. On the way home, the girl spoke 3 words in Breton, further convincing the parents that the girl was Pauline. But when they returned to the farm, Pauline's siblings did not recognise the girl as their sister, and the family as a whole started to have their doubts about the girl's identity. Just a couple of weeks later, at the end of May 1922, a farmer was crossing a field about a mile from the Pickards' farm when he discovered the horribly mutilated and decomposing torso of a small girl. Close to the corpse was a carefully folded pile of clothes that matched the description of the clothes Pauline was wearing when she disappeared. After the police arrived, they also found a severed head, although despite it being devoured by foxes, it didn't seem to match the size and features of a little girl. What was even more perplexing was that the area that the remains were found in had been searched multiple times after Pauline vanished. An examination revealed that the torso was Pauline's, and it was concluded she had died accidentally after getting lost and finding herself stranded in a storm that passed through the night, with the gruesome injuries put down to wild animals, although strangely her torso and stomach were intact, which were the parts of the body often eaten first by scavengers. No cause of death was determined, or an explanation for the folded clothes. In another extraordinary twist, it was revealed that the severed head belonged to an adult male who they were unable to identify. Locals found it hard to believe the reports, as they knew the area where the body was found had been searched several times. People started to speculate that the body wasn't Pauline, and that someone had planted a torso that resembled her. Of course, the big question was, who was the girl from Cherbourg? Well, sadly, no one ever found out. Not long after Pauline's torso was found, the Pickards sent the girl back to Cherbourg to be adopted. The woman, who it was claimed had been trying to abandon her, was traced, although she still had her daughter with her. Suspicion soon fell on a man called Caramon, an umbrella salesman who had worked at the Pickards' farm, but the case against him was dismissed due to lack of evidence. The other suspect was a local farmer called Yves Martin, who visited the Pickards when they arrived home with the girl from Cherbourg, and said, "Are you sure it's Pauline? God forgive me, I am guilty." Then he ran from the farm laughing hysterically, and the following day was taken to a lunatic asylum. Of course, there is another terrifying thought. After all, identified bodies in the 1920s was not an exact science, and it's therefore possible that the dead girl was not Pauline, but the girl from Cherbourg was, and her parents inadvertently sent their own child to be adopted. The Sarah Jo Mystery. On the 11th of February 1979, Scott Moorman, Benjamin Calamer, Peter Hanchett, Patrick Wozner, and Ralph Malaiakini boarded a boat in the town of Hana on the Hawaiian island of Maui for a day's fishing. The boat, named the Sarah Jo, was a 17-feet Boston whaler with an 85 horsepower engine. It was a basic vessel, only equipped for local fishing in calm waters. The men were all friends, had over 50 years of seagoing experience, and Ralph fished for a living. As they set off at around 10 AM, it was a clear day and the water was calm. However, just 2 hours later, the weather worsened, and a major storm approached the islands. Conditions out at sea would have been horrendous, with waves up to 40 feet high, and the Sarah Jo was ill-equipped for such a storm. A number of larger fishing boats managed to stagger back to port, but there was no sign of the Sarah Jo or her crew. When the men failed to return, an extensive search was mounted, and experts even brought in homing pigeons, especially trained to locate people stranded at sea. But after days of searching, it was concluded the Sarah Jo and all on board had wrecked and sank. However, family and friends weren't so quick to abandon their hopes of a rescue and pooled their cash and resources, managing to continue the search for an extra 3 weeks, although sadly, still nothing was found, and they had to accept the men were not coming back. A memorial service for the crew was arranged, which went on to become an annual event. However, over a decade later, some of the original search party members were on a routine wildlife mission around the uninhabited Marshall Islands for the National Marine Fisheries Service. The islands are approximately 2,200 miles southwest from where the Sarah Jo disappeared. On the 10th of September 1988, biologist John Norton came across an abandoned fiberglass boat on the coastlines of the islands. He could only see part of the registration of the boat, but it was enough to convince him that it came from somewhere in the Hawaiian Islands. On further inspection it was confirmed the vessel was the Sarah Joe. A thorough search of inside the boat threw up nothing, so Norton and his team decided to search the surrounding area. That is when they discovered what looked like a grave that had a makeshift cross made out of driftwood. Also sticking out of the shallow grave was a human jawbone. A closer look at the grave revealed some blank pieces of paper about 3 inches square resting on top of a human skeleton. All of the paper was loosely stacked like an unbound book. In between each sheet of paper was a thin silver, or silver-like metal. It was similar to a Chinese burial tradition, where small pieces of paper or paper money separated by gold or silver foil are placed in the coffin as a means of fortune for the afterlife. The team decided they had disrupted the grave enough and felt it was disrespectful to dig any more. However, they took the jawbone back for testing. Results revealed it belonged to Scott Mormon, one of the members on board the Sarah Joe. Another search of the island, where the grave was found, failed to yield any clues to the fate of the other 4 men. It also posed the question, if there were no other survivors, who buried Scott? It does seem likely that Mormon and the boat drifted to the area, but was he the only survivor? Although how a boat as basic as the Sarah Joe could survive one of the worst storms on record and end up on a desolate atoll thousands of miles away is a mystery in itself. Experts have estimated that the drift time between Hawaii and the Marshall Islands would have been somewhere in the region of 3 months. Another conundrum is that 4 years before Norton and his team visited the island, another research team landed there and reported nothing out of the ordinary, even though a grave and a discarded boat would have been hard to miss. So the enduring question is, where was the boat between leaving Hawaii on the 11th of February 1979 and 1984 when the first research team visited the area? To date, no one has a clue, and the mystery rumbles on. Septic Tank Sam. On April 13, 1977, the McLeod family returned to their former homestead in the small town of Tofield, Alberta, Canada, to look for a septic tank pump that they had left behind when they moved out of the now abandoned farm. As they opened the septic tank to look for the pump, they immediately realized something was wrong. Floating on top of the rancid water was a grey sock, but to their horror, they noticed it was still attached to a human leg. They called the police immediately, who slowly drained the tank of its putrid contents using buckets, and a body was discovered. Although at this point it was so decomposed they couldn't determine if it was male or female. They also discovered that after being dumped in the tank, quicklime had been scattered over the corpse to quicken the decomposition process. Although in reality, the combination of quicklime and water caused the corpse to dry out and preserve itself longer than if it had just been left to decompose on its own. What was apparent was the body didn't get into the tank by accident, and they were looking at a deliberate act by someone. No other clues could be found around the homestead, but it was theorized the culprit was someone who knew the area as it was in such a secluded location. Once the corpse was brought back to the morgue and an autopsy was carried out, it was confirmed the body was a male aged between 26 and 40, with dark brown hair, medium build, and approximately 5'5" to 5'7", and likely of Native American descent, and he had been in the tank for up to 12 months. It was also revealed that he almost certainly suffered a serious illness as a child, although the illness had never been made public. The body was dressed in a blue Levi work shirt, a grey t-shirt, blue jeans, grey wool socks, and brown wallaby shoes. Early on in the investigation, the corpse earned the name Septic Tank Sam. Sam had suffered a horrific death and was tortured before being dumped in the tank headfirst, with his hands tied behind his back. It's believed he was burned with both cigarette butts and a blowtorch, and had been severely beaten and sexually mutilated. The only saving grace for poor Sam was he was shot in the head and in the chest before being put in the tank, and wrapped in a yellow bedsheet fastened with a length of cord. The police had very little to work on, and despite releasing a composite sketch and dental records, no one came forward to identify the man. Eventually the body was buried in Edmonton with no name. Later the body was exhumed and DNA samples were taken, as well as detailed measurements of the man's head before he was reburied. From the measurements, the world-renowned Dr. Clyde Snow recreated a skull and a facial reconstruction was made. However, despite repeated appeals, no one came forward to identify Sam. The only thing anyone really knows about him is that he met a violent end and was horrifically dumped in a putrid grave, and his true identity and reasons for his death may never be known. Isidore Fink. The murder of New York laundryman Isidore Fink ranks as one of the most infamous unsolved crimes of all time. Isidore Fink was one of the many immigrants from Poland that came to America at the beginning of the 20th century in search of better life. His dreams, just like many others, were never fulfilled, but one thing did put him in the history book was the way he died. Isidore was a Polish Jew who settled in New York City, where he opened a laundry business he called Fifth Avenue Laundry, and he lived in rooms next door. At 10:30 p.m. on March 9th, 1929, Isidore's neighbour saw him returning home from delivering laundry to his clients and closed his front door. About 15 minutes later, the same neighbour heard sounds of a struggle, and fearing something awful had happened, she summoned a police officer who was on patrol in the area, and they went to check Isidore was okay. However, they were unable to enter his property as all the doors and windows were locked from the inside, apart from a tiny transom window above the front door, which hung with its hinge broken. A child small enough to climb through the tiny window was used to get into the home and open the door from the inside. When officers entered the home, they found Isidore Fink's corpse, shot once in his left hand and twice in his chest. The key to the door was in the inside lock. There was no sign of robbery, and his business cash remained untouched. A thorough search of his home revealed no murder weapon or spent cartridges, and no sign of a struggle. Also, the room looked neat and tidy and undisturbed. Isidore was known to be fearful of being robbed, and was meticulous about keeping his doors and windows locked at all times, and he never allowed strangers to enter either his home or his business. He had no known enemies and no known girlfriend or wife, and police could find no evidence that he was being extorted by local gangsters. What officers were faced with was an apparent motiveless crime committed in a seemingly impossible manner. There was no gun at the scene, which ruled out suicide. The gunshot wound on his hand showed powder burns, indicating he'd been shot at close range. But the door and windows apart from the tiny transom window were all still locked. The only fingerprints at the crime scene were his. So how did he die? Well, that is the unsolvable question. It was impossible for police to find a motive, impossible to find a murder weapon, and seemingly impossible for anyone but a small child to get in or out of the home. To many, the murder of Isidore Fink was the perfect crime that baffled detectives then, and still does to this day. The Lake Bodman Murders. On June 4th, 1960, 15-year-old Mela and Anja and their 18-year-old boyfriends, Seppo and Nils, set out for a camping trip on the shores of the beautiful Lake Bodman, near the Finnish city of Espoo. At around 6 a.m. the next morning, a group of boys who were birdwatching near the campsite noticed a flattened tent and a blonde-haired man walking hurriedly away. At the time, they thought nothing of it, until later, at around 11 a.m., a jogger by the name of Risto stumbled upon a horrific scene and alerted the police. Anja and Seppo's bodies were found in the flattened tent. They had been frantically bludgeoned and stabbed through the tent fabric. Mela was found on top of the tent, naked from the waist down, and with significant stab wounds. All three of them were dead. Mela's boyfriend Nils was also found outside of the tent. He had also sustained several injuries, including a concussion, a fractured jaw, and a deep knife wound to his forehead, but he was still alive when the police arrived on the scene. After police questioned Nils, he claimed to have no memory of the attack, although under hypnosis he gave a description of a blonde man, and a composite sketch was released. Whoever killed the three friends stole several personal items from them, including their wallets and multiple articles of clothing. Although Nils' shoes and some of the clothing were found about half a mile from the crime scene. All of the other items missing, including the murder weapon, have never been found. At the funeral of one of the victims, a man appeared in one of the photographs taken in the day that bore a striking resemblance to Nils' photo fit. However, the man has never come forward or been identified. What do you think? Over the years that followed, police followed up many lines of inquiry and questioned many suspects, but 3 in particular still raised suspicion in the community. Local man Carl Gilstrom, who ran a nearby kiosk, was top of the list. He hated campers and children, and supposedly confessed to the murders during a drunken conversation with a friend. However, his wife gave him a firm alibi, and the police didn't believe he was the culprit. Carl had also been seen filling a well in his front yard only days after the murders, possibly hiding the murder weapon and stolen items, although police searches recovered nothing. However, when he drowned himself in Lake Bodden in 1969, locals were convinced he was the murderer, and when his wife recanted his alibi on her deathbed, many are convinced he was the culprit. Another suspect was Hans Assmann, an alleged KGB spy and former Nazi. He became a suspect after turning up at Helsinki Surgical Hospital the day after the murders, with fingernails black with dirt and his clothes covered in red stains. Hospital staff said that he was acting very nervous and aggressive, and had even feigned unconsciousness. But other than brief questioning, the police did not pursue Assmann any further, claiming that he too had a solid alibi. However, later, Assmann raised some other red flags in regards to the case, when, after seeing a news report about the murders, in which they released the young boy's description of the man they saw leaving the crime scene, Assmann cut off his long blonde hair. For many years, Assmann remained a suspect, and was even suspected of involvement in other unsolved murders. Then in 2004, the case was reopened after 44 years, and advances in DNA technology ruled Assmann out, and put another suspect in the frame. That person was lone survivor Nils Gunderson. According to the prosecution, a drunken Gunderson killed his girlfriend in a fit of jealous rage and got into a fight with Seppo, and that is how he got his facial injuries. He then killed Seppo and Anja in an attempt to dispose of witnesses and inflict his other injuries on himself. Despite a strong defense, Nils was convicted but only served 1 year of his life sentence after a successful appeal granted him his freedom. With Nils cleared and most other suspects dead, it seems as though the children of Bodmin will never have their killer brought to justice. Today it is settled into local legend and will have been told around many campfires to those visiting the area where it happened. The story is also featured in several internet articles, horror films, and of course a Top 5s video. Wind scale. Despite being significantly involved in the Manhattan Project that created the world's first atomic bomb, the UK and other allied countries found themselves locked out of the US nuclear energy program after the war, as the US sought to establish a monopoly on this powerful new field in physics. However, the Americans couldn't retain the information learned by the British scientists during the project, and after the war, they returned to their home country to kickstart Britain's own nuclear weapons and energy programs. As part of that program, a new facility was constructed at Sellafield in Cumbria, England. This immense complex included 2 air-cooled graphite-moderated nuclear reactors, whose purpose was to produce weapons-grade plutonium for the British nuclear weapons program. The reactors were constructed between 1950 and 1951, and were expected to function until 1956. However, that deadline was extended, such was the need for them, and they were still operational in October 1957, despite concerns being raised in some scientific circles over their safety. Such was the high priority of the program, politicians and military leaders chose to ignore the experts' warnings with near-catastrophic results. On October 7, 1957, workers on the number 1 reactor were carrying out a routine procedure on the reactor's graphite core, known as annealing, which is a heat treatment process used mostly to increase the ductility and reduce the hardness of a material. Due to faulty temperature readings, the workers believed the process had not been completed, and so withdrew the control rods to try again. However, in doing so, the nuclear fission process was allowed to restart, resulting in the graphite core's temperature soaring, starting a fire which soon began to burn the surrounding uranium. Unfortunately, it would not be until October 10th before the staff at the plant realized just how serious the situation was. After workers in protective gear observed the damage that had been done and the fire that was raging, the Deputy General Manager of the site, Tom Tuohy, was left with an agonizing choice of what to do. On the one hand, he could let the fire burn itself out, but this would likely spread huge amounts of radiation over hundreds of miles of countryside. On the other hand, if he poured water into the fire to put it out, with all the nuclear material ablaze in front of him and his team, the reaction could potentially produce a nuclear explosion. With no other options, he decided they were going to have to try and fight the fire. One can only imagine how Tom Tuohy must have felt during the firefighting effort, knowing it could result in a nuclear explosion, for not only would he and his men be killed, but his family lived less than a mile away and so would be killed also. Through a careful combination of using water and starving the fire of fresh oxygen that was fueling it, the fire was eventually brought under control. However, Tom's heroic efforts to save the facility and countless lives in the surrounding area would go unappreciated by the British government under Harold Macmillan. The accident couldn't have come at a worse time for Macmillan, who was negotiating with the Americans for Britain to become an equal partner in the nuclear game, allowing them access to America's more advanced technologies. And so rather than blame British nuclear engineering for the incident, his government blamed the workers at the facility, and then covered up as much of the affair as he could. It would not be until a 1989 inquiry into the event that Tom and his people were exonerated. The incident at Windscale remains one of the most dangerous nuclear incidents in the West, being rated as a 5 out of 7 on the INES scale. It's been speculated that as many as 240 more cancer cases than would otherwise be expected that occurred in the surrounding areas can be attributed to the incident. The Lenin Conspiracy. The Cold War was a conflict of secrets and lies. Misinformation aimed at one's own enemies did more than just save national pride when things went wrong. It also helped convince them that your technology was superior, even when this was far from the case. As we have already seen, the Soviet Union was adept at keeping secrets of some of their mistakes, and even today it is suspected that we do not know the whole story of nuclear disasters that occurred on the eastern side of the Iron Curtain. Typifying this is the story of the nuclear-powered icebreaker Lenin and its 1 or maybe 2 nuclear accidents. The Soviet Union had long had a need for icebreakers that could clear a path for ships to enter its northernmost ports during the brutal Arctic winters, when ice patches could quickly build up and strand vessels in port or out at sea. These powerful ships were something of a symbol of the spirit of the Soviet people, who viewed themselves as tougher than their Western counterparts because of the harsh climate in which they lived, and how they were using technology to finally tame that climate. Therefore, it was somewhat fitting that when the Soviets began looking at building the first civilian nuclear-powered ship in the world, it would be an icebreaker. Dubbed the Lenin after the communist leader of the Russian Revolution, which birthed the Soviet Union. The 16,000-ton vessel went into service in 1959, clearing ice patches in and around Murmansk, and helping to keep the northern sea lanes open. Despite the high cost of the vessel compared to conventional icebreakers, nuclear power proved extremely advantageous for the Soviets, as it gave the Lenin almost unlimited range, allowing it to stay at sea as long as its food and fresh water supplies permitted. Because of the risk of the vessel suffering a breakdown and it becoming stuck in the ice itself, something that would have been hugely embarrassing, the vessel's power plant consisted of 3 OK-150-90 megawatt reactors, 2 of which would be running at any one time, while the third would be held in backup. For perspective, just one of these reactors could power roughly 14,760 American homes. Now it's at this point that things get a little vague, and at times contradictory, depending on the source. What is known is that after 5 years of operating, things started to go wrong aboard the Lenin. In February 1965, after it had been shut down for refueling, the coolant was removed from the number 2 reactor. However, the spent fuel that it cooled during normal operation was still inside. As a result, around 124 of the fuel assemblies, around 60%, had melted and deformed in the reactor, trapping them inside the core. It was therefore decided to remove the fuel, control grid, and control rods as a unit for disposal. These being placed in a special cask solidified, and then 2 years later dumped in Sivolki Bay in 1967. Less than 2 years after that one, a second more serious incident reportedly occurred aboard the Lenin, when in 1967, following the loading of fresh nuclear fuel, a pipe sprung a leak, causing cooling liquid to seep out into the reactor compartment. Needing to locate the leak quickly, it was necessary for the crew to break open the shielding surrounding the reactor, which was made of concrete mixed with metal shavings, using sledgehammers. Just how much radiation escaped from the reactor following the breaking of the shielding is unknown, as is the number of casualties that resulted and the environmental impact. The Soviets were quick to cover up the incident, and consequently reports of it in the West were confused, leading some to think that two separate accidents were one larger, ongoing incident, although this is now not deemed to be the case. While the Soviets never released figures, it's often cited that somewhere between 27 and 30 crew members would die following this high-level exposure to the reactor. The Lenin's 3 reactors were later replaced by 2 more modern and powerful ones, and it served in its vital role until 1989, as the Soviet Union found itself on the eve of collapse. It is now a museum ship moored in Murmansk, where visitors can explore its fascinating history, or at least part of it. For who really knows how many ghosts lurk within its hull? Three Mile Island. In the 1970s, the United States was forced to re-evaluate its squandering of fossil fuels to power the country's vast industries and densely populated cities. War and political instability in the Middle East threatened the flow of cheap oil, leading to an almost crippling energy crisis. At the same time, America was still expanding the commercialization of nuclear energy, and new nuclear power stations were appearing across the continental United States. With their almost limitless energy potential, they seemed to offer the solution to powering American cities and industries, and the future for new power station construction looked bright. On one of the new power stations, construction at this time was the 3 Mile Islands plant at Middletown, Pennsylvania, which began operating its first pressurized reactor in 1974, followed by the addition of a second in 1979. At 4 a.m. on March 28, 1979, a cooling circuit malfunctioned, leading to the heating of the coolant tanks, preventing increasing pressure throughout the system. Emergency procedures were initiated, with the reactor being shut down immediately, and the opening of a release valve which allowed enough coolant to escape to reduce pressure and heat within the system. However, it would be this valve that would ultimately cause the incident that was to follow. The valve became stuck in the open position, and as a result, all the coolant was released. To make matters worse, there wasn't any instrumentation in the control room that could have alerted engineers that this had happened. Instead, as they filled the tank with new coolant, they became convinced that there was too much in the system, so they reduced the flow. The remaining coolant turned to steam, and this led to the fuel rods overheating and melting the protective coating, which released radioactive material into the coolant system, which was then ejected into the surrounding area. Homes around the plant were evacuated, and the cleanup process for Reactor 2 would take 12 years and $973 million to decontaminate fully. While there were no official fatalities, numerous lawsuits have been brought against the plant's owners concerning an increase in cancer cases among workers and the people in the immediate area as a result of the incident. However, probably the most damage the incident did was to shake American confidence in nuclear energy, especially after Chernobyl 7 years later revealed just what could have happened that day in 1979. While the nuclear power stations that were under construction at the time were completed, no new ones were approved for over 30 years, and proponents of nuclear energy have claimed that this is why the United States has such relatively high carbon emissions figures, because of the reliance of fossil fuel power stations. Castle Bravo. As part of its effort to maintain its lead on the Soviet Union in the nuclear arms race, in 1954 the United States undertook Operation Castle, which aimed to test ever more devastating nuclear weapons that were proved to the Soviets, that if war ever came, then the United States could annihilate them. On March 1st, 1954, the US detonated their largest nuclear weapon yet, a thermonuclear bomb that they estimated would have a 6 megaton yield, or the equivalent of 400 of the Little Boy bombs dropped on Hiroshima, that killed 66,000 people and seriously injured a further 69,000. The devastating weapon was mounted on an artificial island built on a reef off Namu Island in the Bikini Atoll, and was surrounded by a wide array of diagnostic instruments and high-speed cameras trained through an arc of mirror towers around it. The US wanted to record every aspect of the detonation. At 0645 hours, the natural sunrise was overpowered by an artificial one as the bomb detonated, and right away the scientists and military commanders knew that something wasn't quite right. The blast of the thermonuclear device was far greater than they had anticipated. In fact, measuring in at 15 megatons, it was 2.5 times the size they had anticipated and planned for, and was the most powerful artificial explosion in history up to that time. The reason for the greater yield was determined to be a result of unexpected reactions in the lithium-7 used in the bomb's creation. For military planners, there was a positive in that they now possessed such an earth-shattering weapon, far beyond anything the Soviet Union could produce at the time. But for the local populations in and around the atoll, the results of the test were devastating, as all the safety precautions were tailored for a 6 megaton blast and were thus insufficient. Radioactive fallout in the form of burned surface coral rained down on the populations of the nearby Rongerik and Uterik atolls, leading to a radiation sickness and an emergency evacuation within 48 hours of the blast. Over the coming decades, the tests would continue to inflict pain and suffering on the peoples of the atolls and the surrounding Marshall Islands. Thyroid tumors took hold in statistically larger numbers than before, particularly concerning those who were alive during the test, as did the number of birth defects. The communities also suffered from the loss of many of their fish stock, which had either disappeared or were found suffering from diseases and were inedible. 2 vessels at sea were also doused in the fallout. The US Navy tanker USS Patapsco found itself in the path of the fallout clouds, and lacking decontamination equipment, was ordered to sail to the safety of Pearl Harbor. Unfortunately for the crew of the tanker, the engines suffered a breakdown, leaving them exposed to the fallout, despite being over 560 miles from the detonation. After arriving at Pearl Harbor, measurements were taken of the radioactivity, which were found to be higher than normal but still relatively safe. Not as fortunate were the crew of the Japanese fishing boat Lucky Dragon No. 5 with 23 men on board. Several hours after the detonation, the vessel was sailing well outside the established control zone for the test, not knowing this was now insufficient when fine white ash began raining down on it and its crew. The ash was composed of irradiated coral and soon began to cover the fishing boat to such an extent that the crew began gathering it up in piles in their hands and tossing it overboard. Very soon the men began succumbing to severe radiation sickness, while their eyes turned blood red and began leaking a sticky mucus. By the time they returned to port, painful blisters had appeared on their bodies, and they were quickly admitted to hospital for treatment. But it was not soon enough for the crewman, Kaboyama Aikichi, who died on September 23rd. Japan immediately condemned the test, as did a number of other countries such as India and Australia, both of whom recorded radioactive fallout from the test landing in their territory. There were even minute traces found as far away as Europe and North America. To this day, Castle Bravo remains the most powerful American weapon test in history. As with many nuclear incidents, it's difficult to establish just how many lives have been, and in some cases continue to be affected by the test. The Kishtim explosion. In 1958, Western media began to receive reports ticking in from sources within the Soviet Union of a nuclear incident having occurred somewhere in the Ural Mountains, but without any official corroboration from either the Soviet Union or Western intelligence agencies. The story simply faded into obscurity. That was until nearly 20 years later, when Soviet scientist Suarez Medvedev, who had been stripped of his citizenship because of his anti-Soviet writings, published a paper in London outlining a serious nuclear incident at the Mayak nuclear fuel processing plant near the town of Kishtim on the eastern slope of the Ural Mountains. The Soviets dismissed the reports as propaganda fabricated by a disillusioned ex-Soviet dissident working for the West, and so he and others began a search for evidence of the event, and the result was horrifying. Upon closer inspection of the history of the site, it was clear that the Kishtim disaster was a tragedy in the making, even if the explosion hadn't even occurred. As the Soviet nuclear program began, Soviet understanding of radioactivity and its impacts on people was rather limited, and so, like in other industries of the time, discarded radioactive waste was dumped into the Teka River, where it was believed it would be dissolved or dispersed, to such an extent where it was safe. This of course was not the case. The rural populations in the surrounding areas and along the River Obi, which the Teka joined downstream, continued to use the contaminated water for drinking and cleaning. As a result, it's estimated that up to 124,000 people were exposed to varying levels of radiation that affected their health. Then on September 29, 1957, a storage building at the facility was rocked by an explosion after the cooling system for a quantity of radioactive waste malfunctioned, thus increasing the temperature of the waste significantly. This produced a chemical, as opposed to nuclear, explosion that punched through the concrete barrier surrounding the site, sending radioactive waste hurtling through the air. In terms of radioactive particles released, the explosion is second only to Chernobyl, measuring as a 6 on the INES scale. Over 10,000 people had to be evacuated as a cloud of hot radioactive particles spread outward, being carried by a northeasterly wind, but it's suspected that as many as 270,000 people came into some contact with it. Efforts to put a number on just how many people died as a result of the disaster have been rather difficult. On the one hand, no one at the facility was hurt in the explosion, but various sources state that due to the exposure to radioactive particles released into the atmosphere, some 8,000 people developed cancers, which they otherwise wouldn't have, although there is no solid evidence to support this. The true number could be both lower and of course much higher. But perhaps the truly frightening thing about the Kishtim disaster was just how effective the Soviet cover-up was. Were it not for Medvedev, it is likely that it would have been another 50 to 20 years before the West became fully aware of the incident after the Soviet Union collapsed. This begs the question, are there more incidents that have been so well covered up that we still do not know they occurred? We hope you enjoyed this monster compilation. We salute you if you made it all the way to the end. Remember to check out this video's sponsor by clicking on the link in the description or comment section below. And as always, we'll see you in the next video.